The transformation of mainland Greece during the 17th and 16th centuries BC represents one of archaeology's most compelling narratives of cultural metamorphosis. The transition from the relatively modest Middle Helladic period to the spectacular Late Helladic era did not occur overnight, but rather unfolded through a complex process of external influence, internal development, and gradual social stratification that would ultimately give birth to Europe's first literate civilization. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Peloponnese and central Greece reveals a society in dramatic flux around 1700 BC. The modest settlements of the Middle Helladic period, characterized by simple apsidal houses and utilitarian pottery, began showing signs of increasing sophistication and foreign influence. Excavations at key sites have uncovered layers of destruction and subsequent rebuilding that suggest both violent upheaval and cultural renewal. The pottery assemblages from this transitional period display a fascinating mixture of traditional Middle Helladic forms alongside new shapes and decorative motifs that clearly derive from Minoan Crete. The most striking evidence for this cultural transformation comes from burial practices. The traditional Middle Helladic intramural burials, where the dead were interred within or immediately adjacent to residential areas, gradually gave way to more elaborate extramural cemeteries. These new burial grounds featured increasingly sophisticated grave goods, including bronze weapons, gold ornaments, and imported pottery that spoke to growing wealth disparities and the emergence of a warrior aristocracy. Minoan influence permeated virtually every aspect of early Mycenaean development, creating a cultural synthesis that would define the civilization for centuries to come. The sophisticated palace-centered society of Crete, with its complex administrative systems, artistic traditions, and religious practices, provided a template that mainland Greeks adapted to their own cultural context and geographical circumstances. The artistic revolution that swept through mainland Greece during this period was particularly dramatic. Minoan fresco techniques appeared on palace walls at Mycenaean sites, depicting processions, bull-leaping scenes, and religious ceremonies that closely paralleled those found at Knossos and other Cretan centres. However, these mainland adaptations were not mere copies. Mycenaean artists incorporated distinctly martial themes that reflected their society's warrior ethos, including depictions of boars' tusk helmets, figure-eight shields, and armed processions that had no direct parallel in Minoan art. The adoption of Minoan religious practices created a syncretic system that combined indigenous Greek traditions with Cretan innovations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Mycenaeans embraced the Minoan emphasis on female deities, particularly the snake goddess and various aspects of what scholars term the Great Goddess. Ritual vessels, including the distinctive rite and drinking cups and libation tables, appeared in Mycenaean contexts, often crafted in local workshops but following Cretan prototypes. The famous Linear B tablets from later periods reveal a pantheon that includes recognisably Greek deities, alongside figures that appear to derive from Minoan religious traditions. Perhaps most significantly, the Mycenaeans adopted and adapted Minoan palatial architecture, creating monumental complexes that served as both royal residences and administrative centres. These early palaces incorporated the Minoan concept of the central courtyard, surrounded by multiple stories of rooms serving various functions, but they also featured distinctly Mycenaean innovations, particularly in their defensive capabilities and throne room arrangements. The establishment of major Mycenaean centres at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos during this formative period reflected careful strategic planning that would serve these communities well throughout their long histories. Each site was chosen for specific geographical and military advantages that allowed their inhabitants to control key trade routes and agricultural resources, while maintaining defensive positions against potential enemies. Mycenae itself occupied a commanding position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Argive Plain, one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the Peloponnese. The site's natural defences were formidable, with steep cliffs on three sides and only one practical approach from the northwest. From this elevated position, the rulers of Mycenae could monitor and control traffic moving between the northern and southern Peloponnese, effectively commanding one of the most important overland routes in Bronze Age Greece. The early fortifications at Mycenae, dating to around 1600 BC, consisted of relatively modest walls that enclosed the hilltop citadel, but these would later be expanded into the massive Cyclopean fortifications that still dominate the landscape today. The strategic importance of Mycenae's location extended beyond military considerations. The site controlled access to several mountain passes that connected the Argolid with regions to the north and west, making it a natural hub for trade and communication. Archaeological evidence suggests that, even in its earliest phases, Mycenae was receiving goods from across the eastern Mediterranean, including amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and precious metals from Anatolia. Tiryns, located on a low hill in the eastern Argive plain, complemented Mycenae's strategic position by controlling access to the sea. The site's proximity to the coast made it an ideal location for monitoring maritime trade, while its inland position provided security from seaborne raiders. The earliest fortifications at Tiryns date to approximately 1600 BC and consisted of a relatively simple wall circuit that enclosed the central hill. Like Mycenae, these early defences would later be dramatically expanded, but even in their initial form they represented a significant investment in military architecture that spoke to the growing wealth and organisational capacity of the emerging Mycenaean elite. The relationship between Mycenae and Tiryns during this early period appears to have been complementary rather than competitive. Archaeological evidence suggests extensive contact between the two sites, with similar pottery styles, burial customs, and architectural features appearing at both locations. This cooperation may have reflected kinship ties between ruling families or perhaps a deliberate political alliance designed to maximise control over the Argive plain and its resources. Pylos, situated on the western coast of the Peloponnese, represented a different type of strategic positioning. Unlike the heavily fortified hilltop citadels of the Argolid, early Pylos was established on a relatively low ridge overlooking Navarino Bay. The site's primary advantages lay in its excellent harbour facilities and its position at the terminus of overland routes that connected the western Peloponnese with regions to the north and east. The earliest palace remains at Pylos date to around 1600 BC and show clear Minoan influence in their layout and construction techniques. The development of distinctive Mycenaean pottery styles during this formative period provides some of the clearest evidence for the cultural transformation taking place across mainland Greece. The transition from Middle Helladic to Late Helladic pottery traditions was gradual but unmistakable, reflecting both technological innovations and changing aesthetic preferences that would define Mycenaean material culture for centuries to come. Middle Helladic pottery had been characterized by relatively simple forms and minimal decoration, typically consisting of plain burnished wares in basic shapes suited to everyday domestic use. The most distinctive Middle Helladic pottery type was the so-called grey minion ware, a fine wheel-made pottery with a distinctive soapy feel that was produced in a limited range of forms, including goblets, bowls, and storage jars. The emergence of late Helladic pottery traditions around 1700 to 1600 BC marked a dramatic departure from these earlier traditions. The new pottery styles showed clear Minoan influence in both their technical execution and decorative schemes, but they also incorporated distinctly mainland elements that reflected local preferences and cultural values. The most significant innovation was the development of what archaeologists term Late Helladic I pottery, characterized by more sophisticated shapes, improved firing techniques, and elaborate painted decoration. The decorative motifs that appeared on early Late Helladic pottery drew heavily from Minoan artistic traditions, but adapted them to mainland tastes. Naturalistic designs featuring marine life, plants and animals were particularly popular, often executed in dark paint on a light background in the Minoan manner. However, Mycenaean potters also developed their own distinctive motifs, including geometric patterns and stylized representations of weapons and military equipment that reflected their society's warrior culture. The technical quality of late Helladic pottery represented a significant advance over earlier traditions. Mycenaean potters mastered the use of the potter's wheel, allowing them to produce vessels with thinner walls and more sophisticated profiles. They also developed new firing techniques that produced harder, more durable ceramics with a distinctive lustrous finish that became a hallmark of Mycenaean pottery production. The burial customs that developed during this transitional period provide perhaps the most dramatic evidence for the emergence of a warrior elite culture that would define Mycenaean society. The famous shaft graves at Mycenae, dating to approximately 1650 to 1500 BC, represent one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made in Greece and offer unparalleled insights into the values, beliefs, and material culture of the emerging Mycenaean aristocracy. The shaft graves themselves were impressive engineering achievements, consisting of deep rectangular pits cut into the bedrock and lined with stone slabs. These burial chambers were covered with wooden beams and stone slabs, creating secure underground tombs that could accommodate multiple burials over extended periods. The effort required to construct these graves, combined with the extraordinary wealth of their contents, clearly indicates that they were reserved for the highest levels of Mycenaean society. The grave goods from the shaft graves reveal a warrior culture that prized military prowess above all other virtues. Bronze weapons dominated the assemblages, including long swords, daggers, spearheads, and arrowheads that demonstrated both sophisticated metallurgical skills and a clear emphasis on martial activities. Many of these weapons were decorated with elaborate inlay work featuring hunting and battle scenes that provided vivid glimpses into the worldview of the Mycenaean elite. The famous gold death masks found in the shaft graves, including the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, represent some of the finest examples of early Mycenaean metalwork. These masks, hammered from thin sheets of gold and carefully fitted to cover the faces of the deceased, reflect both the extraordinary wealth available to the Mycenaean elite and their beliefs about death and the afterlife. The individualized features of these masks suggest that they were intended as portrait representations of specific individuals, indicating a level of artistic sophistication that rivaled contemporary work from other advanced Bronze Age civilizations. The presence of extensive gold jewelry in the shaft graves, including diadems, necklaces, and ornamental plaques, demonstrates the Mycenaeans' access to precious metals and their skill in working them. Much of this jewelry shows clear Minoan influence in its design and execution, but it also incorporates distinctly Mycenaean elements, particularly in its emphasis on martial themes and warrior iconography. The ceramic vessels found in the shaft graves provide additional evidence for the cultural transformation taking place in Mycenaean society. These included both locally produced pottery in the new late Helladic styles and imported vessels from Crete and other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. The presence of specialized drinking vessels, including elaborate goblets and rhytons, suggests that the Mycenaean elite had adopted sophisticated dining and drinking customs that reflected their elevated social status. The emergence of Mycenaean civilization during the 17th and 16th centuries BC represented a fundamental transformation in the cultural landscape of mainland Greece. The synthesis of indigenous traditions with Minoan innovations created a distinctive civilization that would dominate the Aegean world for the next 4 centuries, leaving an indelible mark on Greek culture and European history that resonates to this day. The cultural foundations established during the emergence of Mycenaean civilization provided the springboard for an unprecedented expansion of power that would transform the Aegean world. Between 1600 and 1450 BC, the warrior aristocracy that had crystallized around sites like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos evolved into a sophisticated military and political force, capable of projecting influence across vast distances. This transformation was most dramatically revealed through the extraordinary discoveries made in the shaft graves of Mycenae, particularly those found in grave circles A and B, which provided archaeologists with an unparalleled window into the world of Bronze Age warrior kings. Grave Circle B, the earlier of the two burial complexes, contained 24 graves dating from approximately 1650 to 1550 BC. The burials within this circle revealed a society already deeply stratified along lines of wealth and military prowess, but one still in the process of defining its cultural identity. The grave goods from Circle B showed a mixture of Minoan imports and locally produced items that reflected the ongoing cultural synthesis taking place in Mycenaean society. Bronze daggers with elaborate inlay work depicted hunting scenes featuring lions and wild boar, while gold ornaments displayed sophisticated metalworking techniques that rivaled contemporary work from anywhere in the Mediterranean world. The weapons recovered from Grave Circle B demonstrated the Mycenaeans' rapid mastery of bronze metallurgy and their development of distinctly martial artistic traditions. Long bronze swords, some measuring over 90 centimetres in length, were decorated with intricate patterns of gold and silver inlay that transformed functional weapons into works of art. These decorations frequently featured scenes of combat and hunting that provided vivid insights into the values and preoccupations of the Mycenaean elite. One particularly remarkable dagger blade depicted a lion hunt, in which warriors armed with spears and shields pursued their quarry through a landscape filled with papyrus plants, suggesting either direct contact with Egypt or the adoption of artistic motifs that had travelled along Mediterranean trade routes. Grave Circle A, dating from approximately 1600 to 1500 BC, revealed an even more spectacular concentration of wealth and artistic achievement. The 6 shaft graves within this circle contained the remains of 19 individuals, along with grave goods that represented the largest accumulation of precious metals ever discovered in Bronze Age Greece. The total weight of gold objects from Circle A exceeded 15 kilograms, including the famous death masks that have become iconic symbols of Mycenaean civilization. The death masks themselves represented a remarkable fusion of artistic traditions and cultural beliefs. Crafted from thin sheets of hammered gold, these masks were carefully shaped to cover the faces of deceased warriors, creating individualized portraits that suggested beliefs about personal identity extending beyond death. The most famous of these masks, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876 and optimistically dubbed the Mask of Agamemnon, displayed sophisticated techniques of repousse metalwork that created realistic facial features, including detailed moustaches, beards, and even individual wrinkles around the eyes. The military equipment found in the shaft graves revealed the rapid development of Mycenaean warfare technology and tactics. Bronze swords had evolved from the relatively short weapons of the Middle Helladic period into long, thrusting weapons designed for close combat between heavily armed warriors. These swords, some measuring over a metre in length, required sophisticated metallurgical knowledge to produce blades that were both flexible enough to avoid breaking and hard enough to maintain sharp edges. The hilts of these weapons were often decorated with gold and ivory, transforming them into status symbols as much as functional weapons. The development of specialized defensive equipment represented another crucial innovation of this period. The famous boar's tusk helmets, reconstructed from archaeological remains found in the shaft graves, demonstrated the Mycenaeans' ingenuity in creating effective protection from available materials. These helmets consisted of leather caps reinforced with rows of boar tusks that had been carefully cut and shaped to provide overlapping protection for the wearer's head and neck. The construction of a single helmet required tusks from approximately 40 to 50 boars, making these items extremely valuable and likely restricted to the highest levels of the warrior hierarchy. The figure-8 shields that appeared in Mycenaean art and archaeological contexts during this period represented another significant military innovation. These large shields, constructed from multiple layers of oxhide stretched over wooden frames, provided extensive protection for warriors while maintaining sufficient flexibility to allow for effective combat maneuvering. The distinctive shape of these shields, with their pronounced waist and flared top and bottom sections, was designed to protect the warrior's torso while allowing freedom of movement for the arms and legs. Archaeological evidence suggests that these shields were often decorated with bronze or gold ornaments that served both protective and ceremonial functions. The spears and javelins found in the shaft graves reveal the development of sophisticated polearm technology that would remain central to Mycenaean warfare throughout the civilization's existence. Bronze spearheads, some measuring over 30 centimeters in length, were carefully designed with pronounced midribs that provided structural strength while maintaining relatively light weight. The sockets of these spearheads were often reinforced with bronze rings or collars that prevented the wooden shafts from splitting under the stress of combat use. The emergence of organised Mycenaean military forces during this period coincided with a dramatic expansion of their influence throughout the Aegean region. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Greek islands and the Anatolian coast reveals the presence of Mycenaean pottery, weapons, and other cultural materials that indicate either direct colonization or extensive trade relationships. This expansion was not merely commercial, but represented a systematic projection of Mycenaean power that would ultimately challenge Minoan dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The relationship between the Mycenaeans and the Minoans during this period was complex and evolved significantly over time. Early interactions appear to have been primarily peaceful, with Mycenaean elites eagerly adopting Minoan artistic styles, religious practices, and administrative techniques. However, archaeological evidence from Crete suggests that Mycenaean influence on the island increased dramatically during the 16th and 15th centuries BC, culminating in what many scholars interpret as a Mycenaean takeover of major Minoan centres. The evidence for Mycenaean presence on Crete during this period includes the appearance of distinctly Mycenaean pottery styles at Minoan sites, the construction of new architectural features that reflected mainland preferences, and most significantly, the adoption of Linear B script for administrative purposes at Knossos and other major centres. This administrative revolution represented one of the most significant cultural achievements of the Mycenaean expansion, as it marked the first time that a form of Greek language had been committed to writing. Linear B script evolved from the earlier Minoan Linear A writing system, but it was adapted specifically to record the Greek language spoken by the Mycenaeans. This adaptation required considerable linguistic sophistication, as the syllabic structure of Linear A had to be modified to accommodate the different phonetic requirements of Greek. The process of adaptation appears to have taken place gradually, with early Linear B tablets showing experimental approaches to representing Greek sounds and grammatical structures. The administrative systems that developed alongside the adoption of Linear B script reflected the increasing complexity of Mycenaean society and its expanding territorial control. The palace archives that have been preserved at sites like Pylos and Knossos reveal sophisticated bureaucratic structures that managed everything from livestock inventories to military personnel records. These archives documented a society organised around centralised redistribution systems in which the palace collected agricultural products, craft goods, and labour services from surrounding territories and redistributed them according to complex hierarchical arrangements. The Linear B tablets provide detailed insights into the organisation of Mycenaean military forces during this period of expansion. Records from Pylos describe a complex system of military obligations that required different communities to provide specific numbers of warriors, along with their equipment and supplies. These documents reveal that Mycenaean armies were organised into units based on geographic regions, with local commanders responsible for maintaining specified numbers of troops and ensuring their readiness for campaign service. The tablets also document the existence of specialised military roles within Mycenaean society, including chariot warriors, infantry soldiers, and naval personnel. Chariot warfare appears to have been particularly important to the Mycenaean military system, with palace archives recording detailed inventories of chariots, horses, and the specialised equipment required for mounted combat. Archaeological evidence from tomb contexts confirms the high status accorded to chariot warriors, with elaborate burials containing chariot fittings, horse bits, and other equestrian equipment. The expansion of Mycenaean influence during this period was facilitated by their development of advanced naval capabilities. Archaeological evidence from harbour sites and underwater excavations has revealed the remains of Mycenaean ships that were significantly larger and more sophisticated than earlier Greek vessels. These ships, constructed using advanced joinery techniques and equipped with bronze fittings, were capable of carrying substantial cargoes over long distances while maintaining the speed and manoeuvrability necessary for both trade and warfare. The Mycenaean maritime expansion brought them into contact with established civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. Egyptian records from this period mention a people called the Tanaju, who many scholars identify with the Mycenaeans, describing them as skilled warriors and traders who appeared regularly in Egyptian ports. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian sites has confirmed extensive Mycenaean presence, with substantial quantities of Mycenaean pottery found in contexts ranging from royal tombs to ordinary residential areas. The wealth that flowed into Mycenaean centres as a result of this expansion was reflected in increasingly elaborate palace complexes and burial monuments. The Tholos tombs that began appearing during this period represented a dramatic evolution from the earlier shaft graves, featuring sophisticated architectural techniques that create impressive underground chambers capable of accommodating multiple generations of elite burials. These tombs, constructed using carefully fitted stone blocks arranged in corbelled domes, required considerable engineering expertise and represented substantial investments of labour and resources. The administrative complexity revealed by the Linear B archives extended beyond military organisation to encompass detailed management of craft production, agricultural systems, and religious activities. Palace workshops produced goods ranging from bronze weapons and tools to elaborate textiles and precious ornaments, with production levels and quality standards carefully monitored by palace officials. Agricultural records documented complex systems of land tenure and taxation that supported the palace economy while maintaining the loyalty of rural populations. The religious systems that developed during this period of Mycenaean expansion combined traditional Greek elements with practices adopted from Minoan civilization and other Mediterranean cultures. The Linear B tablets record offerings to deities whose names would later appear in classical Greek religion, including Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, but they also mention numerous other divine figures whose identities remain uncertain. This religious synthesis reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Mycenaean civilization during its period of greatest expansion and influence. The sophisticated military apparatus and administrative systems that had crystallized during the rise of Mycenaean power provided the foundation for an unprecedented expansion of influence that would fundamentally reshape the political landscape of the Bronze Age Aegean. By 1450 BC, the warrior aristocracy that had emerged from the shaft graves of Mycenae possessed both the organisational capacity and military technology necessary to challenge the established order throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This period witnessed the most dramatic territorial expansion in Mycenaean history, culminating in their conquest of Minoan Crete and the establishment of a maritime empire that extended from the Italian peninsula to the shores of Cyprus. The conquest of Crete represented the pivotal moment in Mycenaean expansion, marking the end of nearly 6 centuries of Minoan maritime dominance and the beginning of a new era of mainland Greek hegemony in the Aegean. Archaeological evidence from Knossos and other major Cretan centres reveals a complex process of takeover that appears to have unfolded over several decades, rather than through a single decisive military campaign. The destruction layers at Knossos, dating to approximately 1450 BC, show evidence of extensive fire damage that affected the palace complex and surrounding administrative buildings, suggesting a violent conquest that eliminated the existing Minoan ruling elite. The aftermath of this conquest demonstrated the Mycenaeans' sophisticated approach to imperial administration. Rather than simply destroying the existing infrastructure, the new Mycenaean rulers of Crete adapted and expanded the palace complex at Knossos to serve their own administrative needs. The throne room was modified to incorporate distinctly Mycenaean architectural features, including a central hearth surrounded by 4 columns that reflected mainland palatial traditions. New storage facilities were constructed to accommodate the tribute and taxes that flowed into Knossos from across the island, while existing workshops were reorganised to produce goods that met Mycenaean specifications and aesthetic preferences. The most significant evidence for Mycenaean control of Crete comes from the administrative archives discovered at Knossos, which contain over 4,000 linear B tablets dating to the period immediately following the conquest. These documents reveal a comprehensive bureaucratic system that managed every aspect of Cretan society, from livestock inventories to craft production quotas. The tablets record the names of hundreds of individuals, including local administrators who appear to have been retained from the previous Minoan administration, alongside newly appointed Mycenaean officials. This hybrid administrative approach suggests a deliberate policy of incorporating useful elements of Minoan expertise while ensuring ultimate Mycenaean control. The linear B tablets from Knossos provide detailed insights into the economic transformation of Crete under Mycenaean rule. Agricultural records document the systematic reorganisation of land tenure arrangements, with large estates being assigned to Mycenaean nobles while smaller plots remained under the control of local farmers who paid tribute to the palace. Livestock inventories reveal massive herds of sheep and goats that provided wool for the textile workshops that became central to Knossos' economy under Mycenaean administration. These workshops produced fine woolen garments that were traded throughout the Mediterranean, generating substantial revenues that helped finance further Mycenaean expansion. The military records from Knossos reveal the establishment of a comprehensive defence system designed to maintain Mycenaean control over the island. Garrison forces were stationed at strategic locations throughout Crete, with particular concentrations in areas that had shown resistance to the conquest. The tablets record detailed inventories of weapons and military equipment, including bronze swords, spears, and arrows that were manufactured in palace workshops and distributed to loyal troops. Chariot units were maintained at several locations, providing rapid response capabilities that could suppress local uprisings or respond to external threats. The transformation of Knossos under Mycenaean rule extended beyond administrative and military reorganisation to encompass significant architectural modifications that reflected the new ruler's cultural preferences and security concerns. The famous frescoes that adorned the palace walls during the Minoan period were either destroyed or painted over with new decorative schemes that emphasised martial themes and Mycenaean royal imagery. Processions of warriors carrying figure-8 shields and boar's tusk helmets replaced the peaceful religious ceremonies that had characterized Minoan palace art. The conquest of Crete provided the Mycenaeans with access to the extensive trade networks that the Minoans had developed over centuries of maritime activity. Cretan harbours, particularly those at Knossos and other major centres, became bases for Mycenaean merchant vessels that carried goods throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The administrative expertise that the Mycenaeans had acquired through managing their mainland territories proved invaluable in operating these complex commercial networks, which required careful coordination of shipping schedules, cargo manifests, and payment arrangements across vast distances. The expansion of Mycenaean trade networks during this period created commercial relationships that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Aegean civilization. Archaeological evidence from sites in southern Italy reveals substantial Mycenaean settlements that served as trading posts and manufacturing centres. These communities produced pottery and metalwork that combined Mycenaean technical expertise with local Italian materials and artistic traditions. The site of Scoglio del Tonno near Taranto has yielded extensive remains of Mycenaean workshops that produced bronze tools and weapons for distribution throughout the Italian peninsula. The Mycenaean presence in Italy extended beyond simple commercial activity to include what appears to have been systematic colonization of strategic coastal locations. Settlements at sites like Tomatito and Porto Perona featured defensive walls and planned layouts that reflected careful strategic planning rather than organic commercial development. These fortified trading posts controlled access to important harbours while providing secure bases for Mycenaean merchants operating in western Mediterranean waters. The eastern extent of Mycenaean trade networks reached Cyprus, where substantial archaeological evidence documents extensive Mycenaean activity during the 15th and 14th centuries BC. The site of Enkomi on the eastern coast of Cyprus has yielded large quantities of Mycenaean pottery alongside locally produced goods that show clear Mycenaean influence in their shapes and decorative schemes. More significantly, the discovery of Linear B tablets at Enkomi suggests that Mycenaean administrative practices were adopted by local rulers who found these bureaucratic systems useful for managing their own expanding territories. The Mycenaean expansion into Cyprus appears to have been motivated primarily by access to the island's substantial copper deposits, which were essential for bronze production. Archaeological evidence from mining sites in the Troodos Mountains reveals Mycenaean involvement in copper extraction and processing, with specialized tools and techniques that increase production efficiency significantly. The copper ingots found in Mycenaean contexts throughout the Aegean often bear markings that can be traced to specific Cypriot mines, demonstrating the sophisticated supply chains that connected resource extraction sites with manufacturing centres and end users. The diplomatic relationships that developed alongside these expanded trade networks are documented through correspondence found in the archives of major Near Eastern powers. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the court of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, include references to rulers of Ahiyawa, who many scholars identify with the Mycenaeans. These letters describe gift exchanges and diplomatic negotiations that suggest the Mycenaeans were recognized as equals by the major powers of the day, including Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. The wealth generated by these extensive trade networks funded massive construction projects that transformed the physical appearance of major Mycenaean centres. The period between 1450 and 1400 BC witnessed the construction of the most impressive fortification systems ever built in Bronze Age Greece, including the famous Lion Gate at Mycenae and the extraordinary Cyclopean walls of Tiryns. These fortifications represented not merely defensive necessities, but powerful symbols of Mycenaean dominance that were designed to impress both subjects and potential enemies. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, constructed around 1250 BC but planned during the earlier expansion period, exemplified the sophisticated engineering capabilities that the Mycenaeans had developed. The gate itself consisted of massive limestone blocks weighing several tons each, fitted together with precision that required no mortar to maintain structural integrity. The famous relief sculpture above the gate, depicting two lions flanking a central column, was carved from a single block of limestone and represented the first monumental sculpture created in mainland Greece. The defensive walls that surrounded the Lion Gate extended for nearly 1 kilometre around the perimeter of the Mycenaean citadel, enclosing an area of approximately 32,000 square metres. These walls, constructed using the Cyclopean masonry technique that gave them their name, consisted of enormous limestone blocks that were carefully fitted together to create virtually impregnable barriers. The largest blocks in these walls weighed over 10 tons and required sophisticated lifting equipment and construction techniques that demonstrated the advanced engineering knowledge possessed by Mycenaean builders. The fortifications at Tiryns represented an even more impressive achievement in military architecture, featuring walls that reached heights of over 8 metres and thicknesses of up to 17 metres. These massive walls incorporated sophisticated defensive features, including casemate galleries that provided protected positions for archers and spearmen defending the citadel. The galleries themselves were architectural marvels, featuring corbelled ceilings that distributed the enormous weight of the walls, while creating spacious interior chambers that could accommodate substantial garrison forces. The construction techniques employed at Tiryns revealed the Mycenaeans' mastery of advanced engineering principles. The walls were built using a combination of large blocks for the outer faces and smaller stones for the interior fill, creating structures that were both incredibly strong and relatively economical in their use of materials. Drainage systems built into the walls prevented water accumulation that could weaken the foundations, while carefully planned access routes ensured that defenders could move quickly between different sections of the fortifications. The standardization of linear B administrative practices across Mycenaean territories during this period reflected the increasing centralization of political and economic control. Palace archives from sites as distant as Pylos in the western Peloponnese and Thebes in central Greece reveal remarkably similar bureaucratic procedures and record-keeping systems. This standardization was not accidental, but represented a deliberate policy designed to facilitate the management of far-flung territories and diverse populations under centralized Mycenaean control. The Linear B tablets from various sites reveal sophisticated systems for managing agricultural production that maximized yields while ensuring adequate supplies for palace consumption and trade. Land tenure records document complex arrangements whereby palace officials allocated plots to individual farmers in exchange for specified quantities of agricultural products. These arrangements were carefully monitored through regular inspections and detailed record-keeping that tracked everything from seed distribution to harvest yields. The centralized palace economies that emerged during this period represented one of the most sophisticated economic systems developed in Bronze Age Europe. Palace workshops produced goods ranging from everyday pottery and tools to luxury items including jewellery, decorated weapons, and fine textiles. Production was carefully planned to meet both local consumption needs and export requirements, with quality standards maintained through specialised supervisors who ensured that goods met specifications appropriate for their intended markets. The evidence for centralised control extends beyond economic management to encompass religious and ceremonial activities that reinforce the authority of Mycenaean rulers. The Linear B tablets record extensive offerings to various deities, including quantities of precious metals, fine textiles, and agricultural products that were presented at religious ceremonies designed to demonstrate royal piety and ensure divine favour. These ceremonies served important political functions by providing opportunities for rulers to display their wealth and power while reinforcing the religious foundations of their authority. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that had enabled Mycenaean expansion across the Aegean evolved into an intricate bureaucratic system that governed every aspect of daily life within the palace-centred territories. The Linear B tablets discovered at major Mycenaean sites provide unprecedented documentation of this complex economy, revealing a level of administrative detail that surpassed contemporary civilizations in its comprehensiveness and precision. These clay documents, baked hard by the fires that ultimately destroyed the palaces, preserved records of transactions, inventories, and personnel assignments that illuminate the inner workings of Bronze Age Europe's first literate bureaucracy. The Linear B archives from Pylos alone contain over 1,200 tablets that document the administration of the kingdom during the final decades before its destruction around 1200 BC. These records reveal a bureaucratic system of extraordinary complexity, with specialized officials responsible for managing different aspects of the palace economy. The tablets employ a sophisticated vocabulary of administrative terminology, including over 100 different job titles that reflect the specialized nature of Mycenaean governmental organization. Scribes maintained detailed records using standardized formats and measurement systems that facilitated coordination between different administrative departments and regional centres. The land tenure system documented in the Linear B tablets reveals a complex hierarchy of property rights that form the foundation of Mycenaean economic organisation. The tablets distinguish between different categories of land ownership, including plots held directly by the palace, land assigned to religious sanctuaries, and holdings allocated to individual nobles and officials. The most important distinction was between Kitimina land, which belonged to the community or demos, and Kekemina land, which was held by individual proprietors. These categories were not merely legal abstractions, but represented fundamentally different approaches to agricultural management and taxation that affected thousands of farmers throughout Mycenaean territories. The palace controlled vast estates that were managed through a sophisticated system of regional administrators and local overseers. The Linear B tablets record the names of these officials, along with detailed descriptions of their responsibilities, which included supervising agricultural production, collecting taxes, and maintaining accurate records of livestock and stored goods. The Korete and Porokoreta, titles that appear frequently in the tablets, appear to have been high-ranking regional governors responsible for entire districts within the kingdom. These officials commanded substantial resources and maintained their own administrative staffs, creating a hierarchical system that extended palace control throughout the territory. Agricultural production was managed through detailed planning systems that allocated specific crops to different regions based on soil conditions, climate, and strategic considerations. The tablets document the cultivation of barley, wheat, olives, grapes, and various legumes, with production quotas assigned to individual farms and communities. Livestock management was equally sophisticated, with detailed records of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs that tracked breeding programs, wool production, and meat supplies. The palace maintained enormous flocks of sheep, with some tablets recording herds numbering in the thousands that were distributed across multiple grazing areas to maximize productivity while minimizing disease risks. The taxation system that supported the palace economy was based on complex assessments that took into account both the productivity of land holdings and the specific obligations of different social classes. The tablets record various types of tribute, including agricultural products, manufactured goods, and labour services that were collected according to carefully calculated schedules. Some communities were required to provide specific quantities of grain or olive oil, while others contributed textiles, metalwork, or specialised craft products. The assessment procedures appear to have been standardised across the kingdom, with similar measurement units and collection methods employed in different regions. Religious obligations formed an integral component of the taxation system, with substantial resources allocated to support the complex ceremonial activities that legitimised royal authority. The tablets record extensive offerings to various deities, including quantities of precious metals, fine textiles, livestock, and agricultural products that were presented at religious festivals throughout the year. These offerings were not voluntary donations, but represented mandatory contributions that were carefully calculated and rigorously collected by palace officials. The scale of these religious expenditures was enormous, with some festivals requiring hundreds of animals and vast quantities of grain, oil, and wine. The role of the one-axe, the Mycenaean king, was central to this entire administrative system. The Linear B tablets reveal that the one-axe possessed ultimate authority over land allocation, military organisation, and religious ceremonies, but that he exercised this authority through a complex hierarchy of subordinate officials. The Rawaketa, often translated as leader of the people, appears to have been the second-ranking official in the kingdom, with responsibilities that included military command and oversight of regional administration. Below these top-level officials were numerous specialised administrators, including the Tereta, who managed religious affairs, and the Aketa, who appear to have been military officers or royal companions with specific administrative duties. The military organisation documented in the Linear B tablets reveals a sophisticated system of recruitment and equipment supply that supported the warrior culture central to Mycenaean identity. The tablets record detailed inventories of weapons and military equipment, including bronze swords, spears, arrows, and protective gear that were manufactured in palace workshops and distributed to military units. Chariot warfare remained important throughout the Late Bronze Age, with palace archives documenting the maintenance of substantial chariot forces that required specialised craftsmen, horses, and equipment. The tablets also record naval forces, including personnel assigned to ships and coastal defence installations that protected Mycenaean territories from seaborne attacks. The craft specialisation that characterised Mycenaean palace economies reached extraordinary levels of sophistication during this period. Palace workshops employed hundreds of skilled artisans who produced goods ranging from everyday pottery and tools to luxury items including jewellery, decorated weapons, and fine textiles. The Linear B tablets document over 20 different craft specialisations, including bronzesmiths, potters, carpenters, leather workers, and textile workers who were organised into specialised production units under palace supervision. These craftsmen were not independent artisans, but palace employees who received rations, housing and materials in exchange for their specialised services. Textile production represented one of the most important and complex craft industries managed by the palaces. The tablets record enormous quantities of wool that were processed through multiple stages of production, from initial cleaning and spinning through dyeing and weaving into finished garments. The palace workshops at Pylos alone employed over 600 women in textile production, organised into work groups that specialised in different aspects of the manufacturing process. These workers, many of whom appear to have been slaves or dependent labourers, were provided with daily rations of grain, figs and other foodstuffs that were carefully calculated to maintain productivity while minimising costs. The social hierarchy revealed through the Linear B tablets was complex and multifaceted, extending far beyond simple distinctions between nobles and commoners. At the apex of society stood the one-axe and his immediate family, followed by high-ranking officials and military commanders who controlled substantial land holdings and commanded their own administrative staffs. Below these elites were various categories of free citizens, including independent farmers, craftsmen, and traders who owned property but owed various obligations to the palace. The tablets also document numerous categories of dependent labourers, including slaves, debt servants, and specialised workers who were attached to particular estates or workshops. The Demo, or community assembly, appears frequently in the Linear B tablets as a corporate entity that held land and made collective decisions about local affairs. The relationship between the Damo and the palace administration was complex, with the community maintaining certain traditional rights and responsibilities while acknowledging ultimate palace authority. The tablets record disputes between the Damo and individual landholders, suggesting that these communities possessed legal standing and could challenge decisions made by palace officials. This system provided a degree of local autonomy while ensuring that community resources remained available to support palace activities. The economic relationships documented in the Linear B tablets extended beyond the immediate palace territories to encompass trade networks that connected Mycenaean centres with communities throughout the Mediterranean. The tablets record imports of raw materials including metals, ivory and precious stones that were essential for craft production, along with exotic goods that served as status symbols for the Mycenaean elite. Export activities were equally important, with palace workshops producing goods specifically designed for foreign markets. The standardization of weights, measures, and quality standards across different Mycenaean centres facilitated this long-distance trade by ensuring that goods met consistent specifications regardless of their place of manufacture. The redistribution system that characterized Mycenaean palace economies involved the collection of agricultural products and craft goods from throughout the territory, their storage in palace facilities, and their subsequent distribution according to complex hierarchical arrangements. The tablets document enormous storage facilities that could accommodate thousands of jars of oil and wine, along with vast quantities of grain, wool, and other commodities. These stores served multiple functions, providing security against crop failures, supporting palace personnel and activities, and generating surpluses that could be traded for imported goods or used to finance military campaigns. The administrative procedures documented in the Linear B tablets reveal sophisticated accounting systems that track the movement of goods and personnel with remarkable precision. Scribes maintained running inventories of stored commodities, updated records of land assignments and tax obligations, and prepared detailed reports on craft production and military preparations. These records were organized according to standardized formats that facilitated cross-referencing and verification, with multiple copies of important documents maintained to prevent loss of critical information. The scribes themselves were highly trained specialists who underwent extensive education in reading, writing, and mathematical calculation. The religious administration documented in the tablets was as complex as the secular bureaucracy, with specialized officials responsible for managing the numerous sanctuaries and religious festivals that played central roles in Mycenaean society. The tablets record offerings to dozens of different deities, including recognizable figures from later Greek religion, such as Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, alongside numerous other divine beings whose identities remain uncertain. These religious activities required substantial resources and careful coordination, with different festivals occurring throughout the year according to carefully maintained calendars that synchronized agricultural activities with ceremonial obligations. The palace economy's sophistication extended to the management of human resources, with detailed records of personnel assignments, skill levels, and compensation arrangements. The tablets document various categories of palace employees, from high-ranking administrators to specialized craftsmen to unskilled laborers, each with specific duties and corresponding rations or payments. The system included provisions for training new workers, promoting skilled individuals to supervisory positions, and managing the complex logistics of feeding and housing hundreds of palace personnel. This human resource management was essential for maintaining the specialized knowledge and skills that made the palace economy possible. The intricate administrative systems that governed Mycenaean palace economies were inextricably intertwined with religious beliefs and practices that permeated every aspect of Bronze Age Greek society. The Linear B tablets that documented agricultural quotas and craft production also preserved detailed records of religious offerings, ceremonial obligations, and divine hierarchies that reveal a complex theological system combining indigenous Greek traditions with influences absorbed from Minoan Crete and other Mediterranean civilizations. These administrative records, supplemented by archaeological evidence from sanctuaries, tombs, and palace complexes, illuminate a religious culture that served both spiritual needs and crucial political functions in legitimizing royal authority and maintaining social cohesion across diverse Mycenaean territories. The pantheon documented in Linear B texts reveals a fascinating mixture of deities who would later achieve prominence in classical Greek religion, alongside numerous divine figures whose identities remain enigmatic to modern scholars. Zeus appears in the tablets as Diwi, receiving substantial offerings at various sanctuaries throughout Mycenaean territories. The god's prominence in these early records suggests that his later role as king of the gods had already crystallized during the Late Bronze Age, though the specific attributes and mythological associations that would define classical Zeus may have differed significantly from his Mycenaean incarnation. The offerings recorded for Zeus include livestock, precious metals, and agricultural products that were presented at major festivals designed to secure his favour for royal undertakings and ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. Poseidon emerges from the Linear B tablets as perhaps the most important deity in the Mycenaean pantheon, appearing under the name Poseidao and receiving more extensive offerings than any other divine figure. His prominence likely reflected the maritime orientation of Mycenaean civilization, whose wealth and power depended heavily on seaborne trade and naval dominance. The tablets record elaborate ceremonies in Poseidon's honour that involved the sacrifice of bulls, horses, and other valuable animals, suggesting that the god's association with earthquakes and horses was already established during the Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence from coastal sanctuaries reveals altars and offering deposits that confirm the textual evidence for Poseidon's central role in Mycenaean religious practice. Hera appears in the tablets as Ira, receiving offerings that indicate her high status within the divine hierarchy. Her prominence in Mycenaean religion predates her later role as Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, suggesting that her original identity may have been quite different from her classical incarnation. Some scholars interpret the Linear B evidence as indicating that Hera was originally an independent goddess associated with fertility and royal authority, whose marriage to Zeus represented a later theological development that reflected changing political and social structures. The offerings recorded for Hera include fine textiles, precious ornaments, and female animals that may reflect her association with women's activities and concerns. The goddess who appears in the tablets as Atanapoti-Nija, generally identified with the later Athena, receives substantial offerings that suggest her importance in Mycenaean military culture. The epithet Potnia, meaning lady or mistress, appears frequently in Linear B texts in association with various deities, indicating a theological system that emphasized powerful female divinities. Athena's early association with warfare and craftsmanship appears to have been already established during the Mycenaean period, with offerings that included weapons, tools, and products of specialized workshops. Archaeological evidence from palace complexes reveals workshops dedicated to producing items specifically for religious purposes, including elaborate bronze weapons and decorated pottery that served ceremonial rather than practical functions. The mysterious Matareteija, possibly related to the later Greek Meta, appears in contexts that suggest a mother goddess figure who may have derived from Minoan religious traditions. This deity received offerings of agricultural products and domestic animals that reflect concerns with fertility and agricultural productivity. The persistence of such figures in Mycenaean religion demonstrates the syncretic nature of Bronze Age Greek theology, which incorporated elements from various cultural traditions while adapting them to local needs and preferences. The Linear B evidence suggests that these mother goddess figures played particularly important roles in rural communities, where agricultural success was directly linked to divine favour. Dionysus appears in the tablets under a form that may be ancestral to his later classical incarnation. though the specific attributes and mythological associations that would define the god of wine and ecstasy are not clearly evident in the Bronze Age sources. The offerings recorded for this deity include agricultural products that may reflect his association with fertility and seasonal renewal, themes that would later be incorporated into the complex mythology surrounding Dionysus in classical Greek religion. The early appearance of Dionysus in Linear B texts contradicts earlier scholarly theories that portrayed him as a late addition to the Greek pantheon, demonstrating instead that his worship was already established during the Mycenaean period. The sacred architecture that housed these religious activities reveals sophisticated understanding of both practical and symbolic requirements for effective ceremonial spaces. The Megaron-style buildings that served as throne rooms in Mycenaean palaces also functioned as religious centres where the king performed crucial rituals that legitimized his authority and maintained cosmic order. These structures featured central hearths surrounded by 4 columns that supported roof openings designed to allow smoke from sacrificial fires to escape, while creating dramatic lighting effects that enhanced the ceremonial atmosphere. The walls of these megara were decorated with frescoes depicting religious processions, divine figures, and ceremonial activities that reinforced the sacred nature of royal authority. Archaeological excavations at palace sites have revealed numerous smaller shrines and cult rooms that serve specialized religious functions within the broader ceremonial complex. These spaces contained elaborate altars, offering tables and storage facilities for ceremonial equipment that demonstrate the complexity of Mycenaean religious practice. The shrine at Pylos contained a collection of ceremonial vessels, including rhytons, libation bowls, and incense burners that were used in rituals designed to maintain communication between the human and divine realms. The careful preservation of these items in palace storerooms suggests that they were considered extremely valuable and were used only for the most important ceremonial occasions. Household shrines discovered in residential areas reveal the extension of a religious practice beyond palace complexes into the daily lives of ordinary Mycenaeans. These domestic cult installations typically consisted of simple altars or offering tables, where families could make small sacrifices and present offerings to household deities and ancestral spirits. Archaeological evidence suggests that these domestic religious practices followed standardized patterns that were consistent across different regions and social classes, indicating the existence of shared religious traditions that transcended local variations. The offerings found in these contexts include miniature vessels, figurines, and food remains that demonstrate the integration of religious observance into routine domestic activities. The role of palatial religious ceremonies in legitimizing royal power was central to Mycenaean political ideology. The Linear B tablets document elaborate festivals that required the participation of officials from throughout the kingdom, creating opportunities for rulers to display their wealth and piety while reinforcing hierarchical relationships with subordinate nobles and administrators. These ceremonies involved the sacrifice of hundreds of animals, the presentation of valuable offerings, and the performance of complex rituals that demonstrated the king's special relationship with the divine realm. The scale and complexity of these events required months of preparation and substantial resources, reflecting their crucial importance in maintaining political stability and social cohesion. The New Year festival, documented in tablets from Pylos, provides detailed insights into the structure and significance of these major ceremonial occasions. The preparations for this festival began weeks in advance, with officials throughout the kingdom required to contribute specific quantities of livestock, agricultural products, and craft goods that would be used in the ceremonies. The festival itself lasted several days and involved processions, sacrifices, and ritual meals that brought together representatives from across the kingdom. The careful documentation of these activities in palace archives demonstrates their administrative importance and suggests that participation in royal festivals was considered both a privilege and an obligation for Mycenaean nobles and officials. Burial customs throughout the Mycenaean period reflect complex beliefs about death, afterlife, and social status that evolved significantly over time. The chamber tombs that became standard for elite burials during the later Mycenaean period represented a departure from the earlier shaft grave tradition, featuring elaborate underground chambers that could accommodate multiple generations of family members. These tombs were approached through long entrance passages called dromoi that were carefully constructed using fitted stone blocks and covered with earth to create artificial hills that mark the burial sites. The chambers themselves were carved into hillsides, or constructed using corbelled masonry techniques that created impressive vaulted spaces designed to house the deceased and their grave goods for eternity. The Tholos tombs that appeared during the height of Mycenaean power represented the most spectacular achievements in Bronze Age funerary architecture. These monumental structures, also known as beehive tombs, featured circular chambers constructed using carefully shaped stone blocks, arranged in corbelled domes that could reach heights of over 13 meters. The largest of these tombs, including the famous treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, required enormous investments of labour and resources that were justified only by the exceptional status of their intended occupants. The engineering expertise required to construct these tombs without mortar while maintaining structural integrity demonstrates the advanced technical knowledge possessed by Mycenaean builders. The grave goods found in these elaborate tombs reveal beliefs about the afterlife that emphasize the continuation of social status and personal identity beyond death. Warriors were buried with their weapons, including bronze swords, spears and daggers that would presumably serve them in whatever battles awaited in the next world. Women were interred with jewellery, cosmetic implements, and household items that reflected their roles in life and their expected needs in death. The presence of food offerings, including pottery vessels containing oil, wine and other provisions, suggests beliefs about the physical needs of the deceased that required ongoing support from living family members. The social stratification evident in burial practices extended beyond simple distinctions between rich and poor to encompass complex hierarchies that reflected the specialized nature of Mycenaean society. High-ranking officials were buried with symbols of their administrative authority, including seals, writing materials, and ceremonial objects that identified their specific roles within the palace bureaucracy. Craftsmen were interred with the tools of their trades, suggesting that professional identities were expected to continue beyond death. Even relatively modest burials contained carefully selected grave goods that indicated the deceased's position within the social hierarchy and their family's aspirations for their posthumous status. The development of heroic culture during the Mycenaean period laid the foundations for the epic traditions that would later find expression in Homeric poetry. Archaeological evidence from major Mycenaean centres reveals a warrior aristocracy that celebrated martial prowess through elaborate ceremonies, competitive displays, and the preservation of heroic genealogies that connected contemporary rulers with legendary ancestors. The palace workshops that produced decorated weapons, ceremonial armour, and other military equipment served not only practical functions, but also created the material culture that supported heroic ideology and reinforced the values of the warrior elite. The oral traditions that preserved heroic narratives during the Mycenaean period appear to have been maintained by specialized performers who served important functions in palace society. These bards, whose existence is suggested by references in Linear B texts, and by the sophisticated narrative traditions evident in later Greek poetry, were responsible for preserving historical memories, genealogical information, and moral teachings that reinforce social values and political legitimacy. The stories they told combined historical events with mythological elements, creating narrative traditions that served both entertainment and educational functions while preserving cultural memory across generations. The possible historical basis for legendary figures celebrated in later Greek epic poetry has been a subject of scholarly debate since the decipherment of Linear B. Personal names recorded in the tablets show clear connections to figures mentioned in Homeric poetry, though the specific individuals and events described in the epics cannot be directly correlated with historical records. The name Achilleus, possibly related to Achilles, appears in Linear B texts, as does Rawo, which may be connected to Heklalos or similar heroic names. These connections suggest that the epic tradition preserved authentic memories of Mycenaean individuals and events, though these historical elements were transformed through centuries of oral transmission into the mythological narratives that survive in classical literature. The warrior culture that provided the context for heroic traditions was centered on competitive displays of martial skill that reinforced social hierarchies while providing entertainment for palace society. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean sites includes specialized equipment for athletic competitions, including bronze tripods that served as prizes and ceremonial weapons that were awarded to victorious competitors. These contests appear to have followed standardized rules and procedures that were consistent across different Mycenaean centers, suggesting the existence of shared cultural traditions that transcended local political boundaries. The religious and cultural foundations that shaped Mycenaean society found their most enduring expression in the monumental architecture that transformed the Greek landscape during the Late Bronze Age. The sophisticated administrative systems documented in Linear B tablets required physical spaces that could accommodate complex ceremonial functions, while demonstrating royal power through architectural grandeur. The evolution from simple megaron structures to elaborate palatial complexes represented more than mere architectural development. It reflected the growing complexity of Mycenaean society and the increasing resources available to rulers who commanded territories spanning much of the Aegean world. The earliest Mycenaean palatial architecture drew heavily from Minoan prototypes, while incorporating distinctly mainland Greek preferences for defensive positioning and hierarchical spatial organization. The initial palace at Pylos, constructed around 1450 BC, featured a central megaron surrounded by auxiliary chambers that served administrative, storage, and residential functions. This megaron, measuring approximately 11 by 13 meters, contained a circular hearth surrounded by 4 wooden columns that supported the roof structure. The hearth itself was constructed from carefully fitted stone slabs and surrounded by decorative borders that incorporated geometric patterns derived from contemporary pottery designs. The columns were positioned to create optimal sight lines from the throne position to the entrance, ensuring that the king could observe all who entered his presence while remaining in a position of architectural dominance. The walls of the early megaron at Pylos were constructed using a combination of stone foundations and mud brick superstructures that provided adequate structural support while allowing for relatively rapid construction. The stone foundations, built from local limestone blocks, extended approximately 1 meter above ground level and were carefully levelled to provide stable bases for the mud brick walls. These mud brick walls were constructed using standardized bricks that measured roughly 40 by 20 by 10 centimeters, allowing for efficient construction while maintaining structural consistency. The bricks themselves were made from local clay mixed with organic temper that improved their durability and resistance to cracking. The roofing systems employed in early Mycenaean palaces represented sophisticated solutions to the engineering challenges posed by large interior spaces and the need for smoke evacuation from central hearths. The roof structure consisted of heavy wooden beams supported by the 4 central columns, with additional support provided by the perimeter walls. The central portion of the roof featured an opening called an opeion that allowed smoke to escape while admitting natural light to illuminate the interior space. This opening was protected by a raised structure that prevented rain from entering while maintaining adequate ventilation for the hearth below. The gradual expansion of palatial complexes during the 14th and 13th centuries BC reflected the growing administrative needs of increasingly centralized kingdoms. The palace at Pylos underwent multiple phases of construction that transformed it from a relatively simple megaron complex into a sprawling administrative centre containing over 100 rooms organised around multiple courtyards. The final phase of construction, completed shortly before the palace's destruction around 1200 BC, included specialised areas for different administrative functions, including archives rooms for Linear B tablets, workshops for craft production, and storage facilities that could accommodate tribute from across the kingdom. The archives room at Pylos provides exceptional insights into the practical requirements of Mycenaean administrative architecture. This chamber, measuring approximately 3 by 4 metres, contained wooden shelving systems that held over 1,200 Linear B tablets, organised according to subject matter and chronological sequence. The room featured thick walls that provided protection from fire and moisture, while small windows positioned near the ceiling admitted sufficient light for scribal work without creating drafts that could disturb the clay tablets. The floor was constructed from carefully fitted stone slabs that provided a stable surface for the wooden furniture and prevented moisture from seeping up from the ground below. The storage facilities that formed integral components of Mycenaean palaces represented remarkable achievements in both architectural planning and engineering execution. The palace at Pylos contained over 30 storage rooms that could accommodate thousands of storage jars containing oil, wine, grain, and other commodities collected as tribute or produced on palace estates. These storerooms were designed with specific features that optimise preservation conditions for different types of goods. Rooms intended for oil storage featured stone-lined pits that could hold large pithoi jars in stable positions while protecting them from temperature fluctuations. Wine storage areas included raised platforms that kept containers off the ground, while allowing air circulation that prevented spoilage. The drainage systems incorporated into later Mycenaean palaces demonstrated sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering principles that ensured adequate water supply while preventing structural damage from moisture accumulation. The palace at Tiryns featured an elaborate system of stone-lined channels that collected rainwater from roof surfaces and directed it away from the foundations through carefully graded conduits. These drainage channels were constructed using fitted stone slabs that created watertight passages capable of handling substantial water volumes during seasonal storms. The system included collection basins that allowed sediment to settle before water continued through the drainage network, preventing blockages that could cause flooding. The water supply systems developed for major Mycenaean centres represented some of the most impressive engineering achievements of the Bronze Age world. The underground cistern at Mycenae, carved into the bedrock beneath the citadel, provided secure water access during siege conditions while demonstrating remarkable technical expertise in excavation and construction. This cistern was approached through a stepped passage that descended over 18 metres below the surface, with walls lined with fitted stone blocks that prevented collapse and maintained structural integrity. The cistern chamber itself could hold over 4,000 litres of water, collected from springs located outside the citadel walls and channeled through underground conduits that remained hidden from potential enemies. The construction of Tholos tombs during the height of Mycenaean power represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age architectural achievement in Greece, combining sophisticated engineering techniques with symbolic programs that reinforced royal ideology and social hierarchy. The treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, constructed around 1250 BC, exemplified the technical mastery and artistic vision that characterized these monumental burial structures. The tomb's circular chamber, measuring 14.5 metres in diameter and reaching a height of 13.2 metres, was constructed using carefully shaped limestone blocks, arranged in 33 horizontal courses that gradually converged toward the apex through the corbelling technique. The precision required for constructing the treasury of Atreus demanded mathematical calculations that determined the exact dimensions and positioning of each stone block to ensure structural stability while creating the desired architectural effect. Each course of stones was positioned slightly inward from the course below, creating the characteristic beehive profile that gave these tombs their alternative name. The stones themselves were cut to precise specifications using bronze tools and abrasives, with some blocks weighing over 5 tons and requiring sophisticated lifting equipment for positioning. The largest lintel stone above the entrance doorway weighed approximately 120 tons and represented one of the largest architectural elements ever moved and positioned in the ancient world. The entrance passage, or dromos, leading to the treasury of Atreus extended 36 meters into the hillside and was lined with carefully fitted stone blocks that created an impressive ceremonial approach to the tomb chamber. The walls of the dromos were constructed using ashlar masonry techniques that produced smooth surfaces with precisely fitted joints that required no mortar for structural integrity. The passage was designed with a slight upward slope that enhanced the dramatic effect of approaching the tomb, while providing adequate drainage to prevent water accumulation that could damage the structure. The smaller Tholos tombs found throughout Mycenaean territories revealed variations in construction techniques that reflected local resources and building traditions, while maintaining the basic architectural principles established by the major royal tombs. The tomb of Clytemnestra at Mycenae, though smaller than the treasury of Atreus, demonstrated similar engineering sophistication in its corbelled dome construction and carefully planned entrance arrangements. The tomb's chamber measured 11.6 meters in diameter and featured decorative elements including carved rosettes and spiral patterns that enhanced the architectural grandeur while providing symbolic references to religious and royal themes. The engineering challenges posed by Tholos tomb construction required innovations in lifting techniques, stone cutting, and structural analysis that advanced Mycenaean building capabilities significantly. Archaeological evidence from construction sites reveals the use of wooden cranes and pulley systems that allowed builders to position massive stone blocks with precision while minimizing the risk of structural damage. The ramps and scaffolding systems employed during construction were carefully planned to provide access for workers and materials while avoiding interference with previously completed portions of the structure. The Cyclopean fortification walls that surrounded major Mycenaean centres represented perhaps the most visible demonstrations of royal power and engineering capability in the Bronze Age world. These massive defensive structures, constructed using enormous limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, created virtually impregnable barriers that protected palace complexes and their surrounding communities from external threats. The walls at Mycenae, which reached heights of over 12 meters and thicknesses of up to 8 meters, were constructed using blocks that weighed several tons each and required sophisticated construction techniques to achieve the precise fitting that ensured structural stability. The construction process for Cyclopean walls began with careful site preparation that involved levelling bedrock surfaces and establishing foundation courses that would support the enormous weight of the superstructure. The foundation stones were positioned using wooden levers and rollers that allowed workers to move and adjust massive blocks until they achieved optimal fit with adjacent stones. The technique of polygonal masonry employed in these walls required each stone to be individually shaped to fit precisely with its neighbours, creating irregular but extremely strong joints that distributed loads effectively throughout the structure. The defensive innovations incorporated into Mycenaean fortification systems demonstrated sophisticated understanding of siege warfare and military engineering principles. The walls at Tiryns included casemate galleries that provided protected positions for defenders, while creating internal passages that allowed rapid movement between different sections of the fortifications. These galleries were constructed using corbelled roofing techniques that created spacious interior chambers without requiring internal supports that could interfere with defensive activities. The galleries themselves measured up to 20 meters in length and featured arrow slits positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that could cover all approaches to the walls. The sallyports incorporated into the fortification systems at major sites provided secure exits that allowed defenders to launch counterattacks against besieging forces while maintaining the overall integrity of the defensive perimeter. These passages were designed as narrow tunnels that could be easily defended by small numbers of troops while preventing large enemy forces from gaining access to the citadel interior. The sallyport at Tiryns featured a complex entrance system that required attackers to navigate multiple turns and gates while remaining exposed to defensive fire from positions within the walls. The integration of natural landscape features into Mycenaean defensive planning demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military geography and strategic positioning. The citadel at Mycenae was positioned to take maximum advantage of natural cliff faces that provided protection on three sides, while requiring fortification only along the more accessible northwestern approach. The builders incorporated these natural defences into their overall defensive scheme by extending walls to connect with cliff edges and creating a unified defensive perimeter that maximised the protective value of both natural and artificial barriers. The urban planning principles evident in Mycenaean citadels reflected careful consideration of both defensive requirements and administrative needs that governed the daily functioning of palace-centred communities. The layout of the citadel at Mycenae demonstrated hierarchical organisation that placed the most important structures in the most protected positions while ensuring adequate access for administrative and ceremonial activities. The palace complex occupied the highest and most secure portion of the citadel, surrounded by residences for high-ranking officials and nobles who required proximity to the royal court while contributing to the citadel's overall defence. The residential quarters within Mycenaean citadels were organised according to social hierarchy and functional requirements that reflected the complex administrative structures documented in Linear B tablets. High-ranking officials occupied substantial houses that included multiple rooms for different functions, including private quarters, reception areas, and storage facilities for personal possessions and administrative materials. These elite residences featured architectural elements derived from palatial models, including central hearths, columned halls, and decorated wall surfaces that reinforced the social status of their occupants. The workshop areas within citadels were positioned to facilitate both production activities and defensive functions during times of crisis. The bronze-working shops at Mycenae were located near the citadel walls, where they could take advantage of prevailing winds for forge operations while remaining protected within the defensive perimeter. These workshops contained specialised facilities including furnaces, anvils, and tool storage areas that supported the production of weapons, tools, and decorative objects required by the palace economy. The positioning of workshops near defensive walls also ensured that craftsmen could contribute to defensive efforts by producing and repairing weapons during siege conditions. The relationship between upper and lower towns in Mycenaean urban planning reflected both defensive considerations and economic integration that characterized Bronze Age Greek settlements. The lower town at Tiryns contained residential areas, workshops, and commercial facilities that supported the population, serving the palace complex while remaining outside the heavily fortified citadel area. During peaceful periods, these lower town areas functioned as normal urban communities with their own internal organisation and administrative structures. However, during times of threat, the population could retreat within the citadel walls, abandoning the lower town to attackers while maintaining defensive positions in the fortified area. The water management systems that served both upper and lower town areas demonstrated sophisticated planning that ensured adequate supplies for entire communities while maintaining security during siege conditions. The underground water systems at several sites included tunnels that connected citadel areas with springs located in lower town areas, providing secure access to water sources that could not be cut off by besieging forces. These tunnels were constructed using techniques similar to those employed in Tholos tomb construction, with carefully fitted stone linings that prevented collapse while maintaining watertight conditions. The sophisticated urban planning and monumental architecture that characterized mature Mycenaean civilization provided the physical infrastructure necessary for conducting complex diplomatic and commercial relationships that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Aegean world. The palace complexes, with their specialized storage facilities and administrative quarters, served as centers for international trade networks that connected Bronze Age Greece with civilizations from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. The Linear B archives that documented domestic administrative activities also preserved records of foreign contacts, tribute arrangements, and diplomatic protocols that reveal the Mycenaeans as active participants in the sophisticated international system that governed late Bronze Age Mediterranean politics. The diplomatic correspondence discovered in the archives of Amarna, the short-lived capital of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, provides the most direct evidence for Mycenaean participation in the formal diplomatic networks that connected the major powers of the 14th and 13th centuries BC. Among the nearly 400 cuneiform tablets found at this site, several letters reference the kingdom of Ahiyawa, a name that most scholars now confidently identify with the Mycenaean Greeks. These letters, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age, describe gift exchanges, territorial disputes, and marriage negotiations that demonstrate the Mycenaeans' recognition as equals by the established powers of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and the Hittite Empire. The identification of Ahiyawa with the Mycenaeans rests on multiple lines of evidence that extend beyond simple phonetic similarity between the cuneiform spelling and later Greek ethnonyms. Archaeological discoveries throughout the eastern Mediterranean have confirmed extensive Mycenaean presence in regions mentioned in the Ahiyawa correspondence, while the political and military activities described in these letters correspond closely with evidence from Mycenaean sites in Greece and the Aegean islands. The Hittite archives from Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, contain over 30 references to Ahiyawa, spanning nearly 2 centuries, providing detailed insights into the evolving relationship between these two major Bronze Age powers. The earliest Hittite references to Ahiyawa date to the reign of Tudela I around 1400 BC, when Mycenaean territories were apparently included among the enemies defeated during Hittite campaigns in western Anatolia. These initial hostile encounters gradually evolved into more complex diplomatic relationships, as both powers recognized the advantages of cooperation over continued conflict. By the time of Hattusili III in the late 13th century BC, Hittite correspondence describes the king of Ahiyawa as Great King, a title reserved for rulers of major powers who commanded respect as equals in the international diplomatic system. The territorial extent of Ahiyawa, as described in Hittite sources, corresponds remarkably well with archaeological evidence for Mycenaean political control during the Late Bronze Age. Hittite texts mention Ahiyawan authority over islands in the eastern Aegean, including Rhodes and possibly Crete, while describing conflicts over control of strategic positions along the western Anatolian coast. The city of Milawanda, identified by most scholars with classical Miletus, appears frequently in Hittite Ahiyawan correspondence as a contested territory that changed hands multiple times during the 14th and 13th centuries BC. Archaeological excavations at Miletus have confirmed substantial Mycenaean presence during this period, including fortification walls, palace structures, and large quantities of Mycenaean pottery, that support the textual evidence for political control. The diplomatic protocols described in the Hittite archives reveal sophisticated understanding of international law and diplomatic immunity that governed relationships between major Bronze Age powers. Correspondence between Hittite kings and the rulers of Ahiyawa discusses the extradition of political refugees, the resolution of commercial disputes, and the punishment of pirates who disrupted legitimate trade activities. These letters demonstrate that the Mycenaeans participated fully in the diplomatic conventions that regulated international relationships, including the exchange of royal gifts, the negotiation of marriage alliances, and the maintenance of resident ambassadors at foreign courts. The commercial networks that provided the economic foundation for these diplomatic relationships extended throughout the Mediterranean basin and beyond, creating trade connections that linked Mycenaean centres with communities from the British Isles to the Levantine coast. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean sites reveals imported goods that demonstrate the extraordinary geographic scope of these commercial activities. Amber from the Baltic region appears in elite contexts at major Mycenaean centres, having travelled overland through Central Europe via established trade routes that connected northern European communities with Mediterranean markets. Ivory from African elephants was carved by Mycenaean craftsmen into decorative objects that combined exotic materials with local artistic traditions, while lapis lazuli from Afghanistan was incorporated into jewellery and ceremonial objects that displayed the international connections of Mycenaean elites. The standardization of weights and measures across Mycenaean territories facilitated long-distance trade by ensuring that commercial transactions could be conducted efficiently regardless of local variations in measurement systems. Linear B tablets from multiple sites record identical units of measurement for commodities including grain, oil, wool, and metals, indicating centralized control over commercial standards that extended across the entire Mycenaean world. This standardization was essential for conducting business with foreign partners, who required consistent quality and quantity specifications for imported goods. Mycenaean pottery found in archaeological contexts throughout the Mediterranean provides the most abundant evidence for the geographic extent and chronological development of their trade networks. Stirrup jars, the distinctive Mycenaean containers used for transporting oil and other liquid commodities, have been discovered at sites from southern Italy to the Levantine coast, with particularly heavy concentrations in Cyprus, the Dodecanese Islands, and the western coast of Anatolia. The distribution patterns of these vessels reveal systematic commercial relationships rather than casual trading contacts, with some sites yielding hundreds of Mycenaean vessels that indicate regular supply arrangements extending over multiple generations. The island of Cyprus occupied a particularly important position in Mycenaean commercial networks due to its substantial copper deposits and its strategic location at the intersection of trade routes connecting the Aegean with the Levant and Egypt. Archaeological evidence from Cypriot sites reveals extensive Mycenaean settlement during the 14th and 13th centuries BC, including substantial residential quarters, workshops, and administrative buildings that suggest permanent colonization rather than temporary trading posts. The site of Enkomi on the eastern coast of Cyprus has yielded Linear B tablets that document Mycenaean administrative activities, while the nearby harbour installations reveal sophisticated port facilities designed to accommodate the large merchant vessels that carried goods between Cyprus and mainland Greece. The Mycenaean presence in Cyprus extended beyond simple commercial activities to include active participation in the island's copper mining and processing industries. Excavations in the Troodos Mountains have revealed mining installations that show clear evidence of Mycenaean involvement, including specialized tools, processing facilities, and residential areas for workers that reflect mainland Greek architectural traditions. The copper ingots produced in these operations were distributed throughout the eastern Mediterranean, with examples bearing Cypriot origin, marks found in contexts ranging from Sardinian, Nuragi, to Egyptian royal tombs, the western extent of Mycenaean trade networks reached the Italian peninsula, where substantial archaeological evidence documents both commercial contacts and permanent settlements. The site of Scoglio del Tono near Taranto in southern Italy has yielded extensive remains of Mycenaean workshops that produced pottery and metalwork for local consumption and export to other Western Mediterranean markets. These installations appear to have operated continuously for over a century, suggesting stable political arrangements with local Italian communities that facilitated long-term Mycenaean presence in the region. Mycenaean influence in southern Italy extended beyond coastal trading posts to include inland settlements that controlled access to important overland routes connecting the Italian peninsula with Central European trade networks. Archaeological surveys have identified Mycenaean pottery at numerous inland sites, including hilltop settlements that commanded strategic positions overlooking river valleys and mountain passes. The distribution of these finds suggests systematic exploration and settlement of Italian territories that provided access to resources including metals, agricultural products, and exotic materials from regions beyond direct Mycenaean control. The technological innovations that facilitated Mycenaean maritime expansion included significant advances in shipbuilding techniques that produced vessels capable of carrying substantial cargoes over long distances while maintaining adequate speed and maneuverability for both commercial and military operations. Archaeological evidence from harbour sites and underwater excavations has revealed construction techniques that employed sophisticated joinery methods, bronze fittings, and design principles that would influence Mediterranean shipbuilding for centuries. The largest Mycenaean merchant vessels appear to have measured over 20 metres in length and could carry cargoes exceeding 10 tons, making them among the largest ships operating in Bronze Age waters. The navigation techniques employed by Mycenaean mariners combined traditional methods based on celestial observation and landmark recognition with innovations that improved accuracy and safety during long-distance voyages. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mycenaean navigators used portable sundials and other astronomical instruments to determine position and direction, while maintaining detailed knowledge of seasonal wind patterns, current flows, and weather conditions that affected sailing conditions throughout the Mediterranean. The consistency of Mycenaean pottery styles found at distant sites indicates regular communication between far-flung settlements that required reliable navigation techniques and standardized sailing schedules. Cultural exchange resulting from these extensive commercial and diplomatic contacts profoundly influenced Mycenaean artistic traditions, religious practices, and technological development. Foreign artistic motifs appeared in Mycenaean contexts with increasing frequency during the 14th and 13th centuries BC, including Egyptian-inspired decorative elements, Anatolian metalworking techniques, and Italian ceramic forms that were adapted to local preferences and production capabilities. Palace workshops at major Mycenaean centres employed craftsmen who had acquired specialised skills through contact with foreign traditions, creating hybrid artistic styles that combined international influences with distinctly Greek aesthetic preferences. The adoption of foreign religious concepts and practices enriched Mycenaean theological traditions, while maintaining essential continuity with indigenous Greek beliefs. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals the incorporation of ritual objects, ceremonial practices, and iconographic elements derived from Egyptian, Anatolian, and Levantine religious traditions. These foreign influences were not simply copied, but were carefully integrated into existing Mycenaean religious systems in ways that enhanced rather than replaced traditional practices. The result was a syncretic religious culture that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Mycenaean civilization while preserving its essential Greek character. Military innovations adopted through foreign contacts significantly enhanced Mycenaean warfare capabilities and contributed to their continued political dominance in the Aegean region. The introduction of new weapon types, including improved sword designs, specialized arrowheads, and enhanced protective equipment, reflected technological exchanges with contemporary civilizations that possessed complementary military expertise. Hittite influence appears to have been particularly important in the development of Mycenaean chariot warfare, with archaeological evidence suggesting the adoption of Anatolian harness designs, chariot construction techniques, and tactical innovations that improved the effectiveness of mounted combat units. The diplomatic marriages that cemented political alliances between Mycenaean rulers and foreign royal families created opportunities for cultural exchange that extended far beyond formal political relationships. Foreign queens and princesses who joined Mycenaean royal households brought with them artistic traditions, religious practices, and technological knowledge that influenced palace culture and filtered down through social hierarchies to affect broader population groups. Archaeological evidence from palace contexts includes personal possessions, religious objects, and artistic works that reflect foreign origins while demonstrating their integration into Mycenaean elite culture. The tribute relationships documented in both Mycenaean archives and foreign sources reveal complex economic arrangements that provided mutual benefits while reinforcing political hierarchies between different Bronze Age powers. Mycenaean territories apparently paid tribute to more powerful neighbours under certain circumstances while receiving tribute from smaller communities that sought Mycenaean protection or commercial access. These tribute arrangements involved not only material goods, but also technological knowledge, skilled craftsmen, and military support that created networks of interdependence extending throughout the Eastern Mediterranean political system. The decline of these international relationships during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC contributed significantly to the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilization throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. As political instability disrupted established trade routes and diplomatic protocols, the Mycenaean palace economies that depended heavily on foreign commerce and tribute began experiencing severe financial difficulties that undermined their ability to maintain the complex administrative systems that had sustained their power for over 2 centuries. The archaeological evidence for this decline includes the abandonment of foreign settlements, the disruption of pottery distribution networks, and the cessation of diplomatic correspondence that had previously documented active Mycenaean participation in international affairs. The disruption of established diplomatic and commercial networks during the late 13th century BC coincided with intensifying Mycenaean military activities along the western coast of Anatolia, where archaeological evidence reveals a complex pattern of conquest, settlement, and conflict that provides the historical backdrop for the legendary Trojan War. The systematic exploration of strategic positions along the Anatolian coastline represented a natural extension of the expansionist policies that had previously brought Cyprus, Crete, and southern Italy under Mycenaean control. However, these western Anatolian campaigns encountered significantly stronger resistance from well-established local populations and their Hittite allies, creating prolonged conflicts that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of Bronze Age political systems throughout the region. The archaeological record from sites along the western Anatolian coast reveals extensive evidence of Mycenaean presence during the 14th and 13th centuries BC, including fortified settlements, cemetery areas, and substantial quantities of Mycenaean pottery that indicate permanent colonization rather than temporary military occupation. The site of Miletus, ancient Milawanda, has yielded particularly rich evidence for Mycenaean settlement, including a massive fortification wall constructed using Cyclopean masonry techniques identical to those employed at major centres in mainland Greece. This defensive circuit, measuring over 1.2 kilometres in circumference, enclosed an area of approximately 74 hectares that contained residential quarters, workshop areas, and administrative buildings arranged according to Mycenaean urban planning principles. The fortification system at Miletus incorporated sophisticated defensive innovations that reflected the military challenges posed by conducting warfare in hostile territory far from Mycenaean home bases. The walls featured projecting bastions positioned at regular intervals that provided overlapping fields of fire for defending archers, while creating protected sally ports for launching counterattacks against besieging forces. The main gate complex included a series of narrow passages and courtyards that forced attacking troops to advance through confined spaces while remaining exposed to defensive fire from multiple positions. These architectural features demonstrate that Mycenaean military engineers had adapted their traditional fortress designs to meet the specific requirements of colonial warfare in contested territories. The residential areas within the Miletus fortifications reveal a mixed population that included both Mycenaean colonists and local Anatolian inhabitants who had been incorporated into the colonial administration. Archaeological analysis of pottery assemblages shows a gradual blending of Mycenaean and local ceramic traditions, with locally produced vessels adopting Mycenaean shapes and decorative motifs, while maintaining certain indigenous technical characteristics. This ceramic evidence suggests a process of cultural integration that extended over several generations, indicating that Mycenaean control of Miletus was maintained for a considerable period, rather than representing a brief military occupation. The cemetery areas associated with Mycenaean Miletus provide additional insights into the social organisation and cultural practices of colonial communities established far from the Greek mainland. The burial customs documented at these sites combined traditional Mycenaean practices with local Anatolian elements, creating hybrid funeral traditions that reflected the mixed cultural environment of colonial society. Mycenaean-style chamber tombs contained grave goods that included both imported Greek pottery and locally produced items, while the positioning and construction of these tombs followed Anatolian conventions that demonstrated adaptation to local geographical and cultural conditions. The strategic importance of Miletus within broader Mycenaean expansion plans becomes clear when considered alongside contemporary Hittite archives that document prolonged conflicts over control of this and other Western Anatolian cities. Hittite records describe multiple military campaigns designed to expel Mycenaean forces from territories that the Hittites considered part of their legitimate sphere of influence. These campaigns achieved temporary success in several instances, but archaeological evidence suggests that Mycenaean control was repeatedly re-established, indicating a pattern of conquest, loss, and reconquest that characterized Anatolian warfare during this period. The site of Troy itself, located at the strategic entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, provides the most compelling archaeological evidence for the historical conflicts that may have inspired the later epic traditions associated with the Trojan War. The settlement designated as Troy 7a by archaeologists represents a substantial fortified city that flourished during the 13th and early 12th centuries BC, precisely the period when Mycenaean expansion in western Anatolia reached its greatest intensity. The archaeological evidence from this phase of Troy's occupation reveals a prosperous community with strong defensive capabilities and extensive trade connections that would have made it an attractive target for Mycenaean military ambitions. The fortification system of Troy 7a consisted of massive stone walls that incorporated both earlier defensive elements and new construction phases designed to meet evolving military threats. The walls reached heights of over 9 meters in some sections and featured sophisticated gate complexes that controlled access to the citadel interior. Archaeological excavation has revealed evidence of repairs and modifications to these fortifications that suggest they experienced actual siege conditions, including damage from projectile weapons and attempts to undermine wall foundations. The presence of numerous arrowheads and other weapons in the destruction layers provides direct evidence for violent conflicts that resulted in the city's eventual destruction around 1180 BC. The destruction layer associated with the end of Troy 7a contains archaeological evidence that corresponds remarkably well with later Greek traditions about the Trojan War, though the specific details of these conflicts remain subjects of scholarly debate. The destruction appears to have resulted from deliberate human action rather than natural disasters, with extensive fire damage affecting residential and administrative areas throughout the site. The presence of unburied human remains in some areas suggests sudden violent death, while the absence of valuable portable goods indicates systematic looting by conquering forces. These archaeological patterns are consistent with the capture and destruction of a major fortified city following a prolonged siege. The dating of Troy 7a's destruction has generated considerable scholarly controversy, with different analytical methods producing dates ranging from 1250 to 1150 BC. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials from the destruction layer has yielded dates clustering around 1180 BC, while ceramic evidence suggests connections with pottery styles that were current during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. The chronological uncertainty reflects both the limitations of available dating techniques and the complex stratigraphic relationships that characterize this heavily occupied archaeological site. However, the broad chronological framework places the destruction of Troy 7a within the period of documented Mycenaean military activity in western Anatolia, supporting the possibility of historical connections with later epic traditions. The identity of Troy 7a with the Homeric Ilios remains a matter of ongoing scholarly investigation, though the geographical location and archaeological evidence provide strong support for this identification. The site's position at the entrance to the Dardanelles would have given its rulers control over maritime traffic between the Aegean and Black Seas, creating economic and strategic incentives for Mycenaean military intervention. The substantial fortifications and evidence for violent destruction are consistent with the siege warfare described in later Greek epic poetry, while the chronological framework places these events within the period of active Mycenaean expansion in the region. The broader pattern of Mycenaean military activity in western Anatolia extended beyond individual sites like Troy and Miletus to encompass systematic campaigns against multiple targets throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from sites including Ephesus, Colophon and Sardis reveals varying degrees of Mycenaean influence during the Late Bronze Age, ranging from commercial contacts to apparent military occupation. The distribution of Mycenaean pottery and other cultural materials suggests coordinated military and commercial activities that were designed to establish comprehensive control over strategic coastal positions and their associated trade routes. The military organization that supported these Anatolian campaigns represented a significant evolution from earlier Mycenaean warfare practices, incorporating innovations in logistics, coordination, and tactical deployment that reflected the challenges of conducting prolonged operations in distant territories. Linear B tablets from mainland Greek sites document the mobilization of military resources from multiple palace centers, indicating that Anatolian campaigns involved coordinated efforts by different Mycenaean kingdoms rather than independent actions by individual rulers. The scale of these military commitments required sophisticated planning and resource allocation that strained the administrative capabilities of participating palace centers. The evidence for confederation warfare among Mycenaean centers during this period comes primarily from Linear B tablets that document military obligations and resource contributions from multiple kingdoms. The archives from Pylos contain records of troop levies that were apparently coordinated with other Mycenaean centres, while tablets from Knossos describe naval preparations that involved vessels from different regions. These administrative documents suggest that major military campaigns were planned and executed through cooperative arrangements between different palace centres creating temporary military alliances that could mobilize resources exceeding those available to any individual kingdom. The logistics of conducting military campaigns in Western Anatolia required unprecedented coordination between naval and land forces operating hundreds of kilometres from their home bases. Archaeological evidence from harbour sites along the western Anatolian coast reveals specialised facilities designed to support large-scale military operations, including protected anchorages, supply storage areas, and repair facilities for ships and equipment. These installations represent substantial investments in military infrastructure that indicate long-term strategic planning rather than opportunistic raiding activities. The technological innovations that accompanied Mycenaean Anatolian campaigns included significant advances in siege warfare techniques that reflected the challenges posed by attacking well-fortified cities defended by experienced military forces. Archaeological evidence from siege contexts reveals the use of specialized equipment, including battering rams, scaling ladders, and projectile weapons that were specifically designed for assault operations against fortified positions. The development of these siege technologies required substantial resources and specialized knowledge that could only be maintained through coordinated efforts by multiple palace centers. The military engineering capabilities demonstrated during Anatolian campaigns extended beyond siege equipment to encompass sophisticated understanding of logistics, communications, and supply chain management. The maintenance of military forces operating far from home bases required careful planning of supply routes, establishment of secure supply depots, and coordination of shipping schedules that could deliver necessary materials and reinforcements according to campaign requirements. Linear B tablets document the complex administrative procedures required to support these operations, including detailed inventories of weapons, equipment, food supplies, and transport vessels. The resistance encountered by Mycenaean forces in Western Anatolia came not only from local populations, but also from Hittite military forces that were dispatched to support their Anatolian allies and vassals. Hittite archives document multiple campaigns specifically designed to counter Mycenaean expansion, including large-scale military operations that involved coordination between Hittite regular forces and local Anatolian militias. These campaigns achieved varying degrees of success, with some resulting in temporary expulsion of Mycenaean forces, while others ended in negotiated settlements that recognized spheres of influence for both powers. The diplomatic negotiations that accompanied military conflicts in Western Anatolia reveal sophisticated understanding of international law and territorial rights that governed relationships between major Bronze Age powers. Hittite correspondence describes attempts to resolve territorial disputes through diplomatic means, including the establishment of buffer zones, the recognition of neutral territories, and the negotiation of tribute arrangements that would satisfy both Hittite and Mycenaean territorial claims. These diplomatic efforts were generally unsuccessful in preventing renewed conflicts, but they demonstrate the existence of recognized legal frameworks for resolving international disputes. The economic motivations underlying Mycenaean expansion into Western Anatolia included access to important trade routes, control of strategic harbours, and exploitation of local resources including agricultural products and mineral deposits. The Western Anatolian coast provided access to overland trade routes that connected the Aegean with central Anatolian markets and beyond to Mesopotamian commercial networks. Control of key harbours and coastal settlements would have allowed Mycenaean merchants to dominate maritime trade throughout the eastern Aegean while extracting tribute and taxes from local commercial activities. The cultural impact of prolonged military campaigns in Western Anatolia extended beyond immediate military objectives to encompass broader changes in Mycenaean society and culture. The exposure to Anatolian military techniques, artistic traditions, and technological innovations influenced Mycenaean development in multiple areas, while the wealth acquired through successful campaigns funded construction projects and artistic production at major palace centres. The prestige associated with military success in distant territories enhanced the status of participating rulers and warriors, contributing to the development of heroic ideologies that would later find expression in epic poetry. The ultimate failure of Mycenaean expansion in western Anatolia contributed significantly to the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilization throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The enormous resources committed to these campaigns strained palace economies beyond their capacity to maintain essential administrative and military functions, while the prolonged conflicts disrupted trade networks and diplomatic relationships that had previously sustained Mycenaean prosperity. The archaeological evidence for widespread destruction and abandonment at Mycenaean sites during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC reflects the cumulative impact of military overextension and economic exhaustion that resulted from these ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful expansion efforts. The ambitious military campaigns and extensive resource commitments that had characterized Mycenaean expansion in western Anatolia created unsustainable pressures on palace economies that had already been strained by centuries of maintaining complex administrative systems and international trade networks. By 1250 BC, archaeological evidence from major Mycenaean centres reveals the first signs of systematic stress, including reduced construction activities, simplified pottery production, and the abandonment of outlying settlements that could no longer be adequately defended or supplied. These early indicators of decline preceded by several decades the catastrophic destructions that would ultimately bring Mycenaean civilization to an end, suggesting that the collapse resulted from accumulated pressures rather than sudden external shocks. The Linear B archives from Pylos provide the most detailed documentation of a Mycenaean kingdom in crisis during the final decades before destruction. The tablets from the palace's last years record increasingly desperate attempts to mobilize military resources and maintain defensive preparations against unspecified threats. Military personnel records show the deployment of troops to coastal positions and the organization of naval patrols that suggest expectations of seaborne attacks. More significantly, the tablets document the systematic collection of bronze objects from throughout the kingdom, including religious dedications and household implements, for conversion into weapons and military equipment. This bronze collection program indicates severe shortages of raw materials that had previously been obtained through international trade networks. The defensive preparations documented at Pylos extended beyond simple military mobilization to encompass comprehensive reorganization of the kingdom's administrative and economic systems. Palace officials implemented emergency measures that included the redistribution of livestock from exposed rural areas to more secure locations, the consolidation of grain supplies in fortified storage facilities, and the evacuation of non-essential personnel from vulnerable coastal settlements. These preparations suggest that the palace administration possessed advanced knowledge of impending attacks and had sufficient time to implement defensive measures, contradicting theories that attribute Mycenaean collapse to sudden surprise assaults. Archaeological evidence from the destruction of Pylos around 1200 BC reveals the ultimate failure of these defensive preparations. The palace complex was systematically destroyed by intense fires that reached temperatures sufficient to bake the Linear B tablets hard enough to preserve them for modern discovery. The destruction was thorough and deliberate, with evidence of organized looting that removed valuable portable objects while leaving behind only items too heavy or bulky to transport easily. The absence of defensive weapons or evidence of battle casualties within the palace complex suggests that the site may have been abandoned by its defenders before the final assault, though this interpretation remains controversial among archaeologists. The destruction at Mycenae itself followed a similar pattern, though the evidence suggests a more prolonged period of decline before the final catastrophe. Archaeological analysis reveals multiple phases of destruction and partial reconstruction during the 13th century BC, indicating that the citadel experienced repeated attacks or internal conflicts that gradually weakened its defensive capabilities. The famous Lion Gate shows evidence of repairs using inferior construction techniques compared to the original work, while sections of the Cyclopean walls were hastily reinforced with additional masonry that suggests urgent defensive preparations. The final destruction around 1200 BC was preceded by the abandonment of the lower town and the concentration of the remaining population within the heavily fortified citadel area. The evidence from Tiryns reveals perhaps the most dramatic example of Mycenaean defensive adaptations during the crisis period. Archaeological excavations have uncovered an underground tunnel system that connected the citadel with external water sources, allowing the defenders to maintain access to fresh water during prolonged siege conditions. This tunnel, carved through solid rock using bronze tools and measuring over 20 meters in length, represents an enormous investment of labor and resources that indicates serious expectations of extended siege warfare. The construction techniques employed in this project demonstrate that Mycenaean engineering capabilities remained sophisticated even during periods of severe crisis. The systematic destruction of Mycenaean centres around 1200 BC extended beyond the major palatial sites to encompass smaller settlements and rural installations throughout the Greek mainland and islands. Archaeological surveys have documented the abandonment of hundreds of sites during this period, including agricultural settlements, mining installations, and coastal trading posts that had previously supported the palace economies. The scale and synchronicity of these abandonments suggest coordinated attacks or widespread social collapse, rather than localized conflicts between individual communities. The theories proposed to explain this widespread destruction have evolved significantly as archaeological evidence has accumulated and analytical techniques have improved. Early interpretations focused on external invasion, particularly by the mysterious sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian and other Near Eastern sources. These maritime raiders appear to have attacked coastal settlements throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, creating disruptions that coincided chronologically with Mycenaean collapse. However, the identification of specific sea peoples groups with particular archaeological cultures remains problematic, and the extent of their role in Mycenaean destruction continues to be debated. The sea peoples phenomenon, as documented in Egyptian sources, included multiple distinct groups that conducted coordinated attacks against established Bronze Age civilizations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The most detailed Egyptian account inscribed on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu describes a confederation of maritime peoples who had previously destroyed the Hittite Empire and other Anatolian kingdoms before advancing against Egypt itself. The Egyptian reliefs depict these raiders using distinctive weapons and equipment, including feathered headdresses, round shields, and long swords that differ from traditional Egyptian military gear. Some scholars have suggested that certain sea peoples groups may have originated from the Aegean region, possibly representing displaced Mycenaean populations who had turned to raiding after the collapse of their own palace-centered societies. Climate change represents another significant factor that may have contributed to Mycenaean collapse through its effects on agricultural productivity and environmental stability. Paleoclimatic evidence from the Eastern Mediterranean indicates a period of increased aridity and temperature fluctuations during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC that would have reduced crop yields and stressed agricultural systems. Pollen analysis from lake sediments and deep-sea cores reveals changes in vegetation patterns that suggest decreased rainfall and more frequent drought conditions throughout the Aegean region. These environmental changes would have been particularly damaging to the intensive agricultural systems that supported Mycenaean palace economies, creating food shortages that undermined social stability and political authority. The evidence for climate-induced agricultural stress includes changes in settlement patterns that show the abandonment of marginal agricultural areas and the concentration of population in regions with more reliable water sources. Archaeological surveys have documented the desertion of highland settlements that had previously been occupied continuously for centuries, while coastal and riverine sites show evidence of increased population density that may reflect internal migration from less favourable areas. The Linear B tablets from Pylos include records of emergency grain distributions and livestock transfers that suggest palace administrators were responding to agricultural shortfalls through redistributive measures. Natural disasters, including earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, may have compounded the effects of climate change and military conflicts in undermining Mycenaean stability. The eastern Mediterranean region is seismically active, and geological evidence indicates several major earthquake events during the Late Bronze Age that could have damaged urban infrastructure and disrupted agricultural systems. The destruction layers at some Mycenaean sites show evidence of structural collapse consistent with seismic damage, though distinguishing earthquake destruction from deliberate demolition remains challenging for archaeologists. The cumulative effects of repeated natural disasters would have strained palace resources and reduced their capacity to respond effectively to military threats or economic crises. Internal warfare between different Mycenaean kingdoms represents another potential contributing factor to the collapse, though the evidence for such conflicts remains largely circumstantial. The Linear B tablets document territorial disputes and resource competition between different palace centres, while archaeological evidence reveals the construction of new fortifications and the strengthening of existing defences during the 13th century BC. These defensive preparations may have been directed against other Mycenaean kingdoms as much as against external enemies, suggesting that the confederation warfare that had characterised earlier Anatolian campaigns had devolved into destructive internal conflicts that weakened all participants. The breakdown of international trade networks during the late 13th century BC eliminated crucial sources of raw materials and luxury goods that had supported Mycenaean palace economies for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows dramatic reductions in imported goods at Mycenaean sites, including the virtual disappearance of foreign pottery, metals, and exotic materials that had previously been common in elite contexts. The disruption of copper supplies from Cyprus was particularly damaging, as bronze production was essential for manufacturing tools, weapons, and other essential items. The collapse of trade relationships with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia eliminated markets for Mycenaean exports, while cutting off access to technologies and ideas that had stimulated innovation and development. Systems collapse theory provides a comprehensive framework for understanding how multiple stresses could have combined to overwhelm Mycenaean adaptive capabilities and trigger comprehensive societal breakdown. This theoretical approach emphasizes the interconnected nature of political, economic, and social systems that made Bronze Age civilizations vulnerable to cascading failures when multiple stresses occurred simultaneously. The complexity of Mycenaean administrative systems, while enabling impressive achievements during stable periods, created vulnerabilities that became critical weaknesses when external pressures exceeded the system's capacity for adaptation and response. The administrative complexity documented in Linear B archives required substantial human and material resources to maintain, creating fixed costs that could not be easily reduced during periods of economic stress. The specialised knowledge required for palace administration was concentrated in relatively small numbers of trained scribes and officials whose loss through death, displacement, or defection could cripple entire bureaucratic systems. The interdependence between different palace centres meant that the collapse of one kingdom could trigger cascading failures throughout the broader Mycenaean world as trade relationships, military alliances, and administrative cooperation were disrupted. The abandonment of Linear B writing represents one of the most dramatic indicators of administrative collapse, as this crucial technology disappeared completely from the archaeological record after 1200 BC. The loss of literacy had profound implications for maintaining the complex record-keeping systems that had enabled palace economies to function effectively. Without written records, administrators could not track tribute obligations, monitor agricultural production, or coordinate military preparations across the extensive territories controlled by Mycenaean kingdoms. The disappearance of writing also eliminated the means for maintaining diplomatic correspondence and commercial contracts that had connected Mycenaean centres with foreign partners. Population movements during and after the collapse period created additional instabilities that prevented recovery and reconstruction of Mycenaean political systems. Archaeological evidence reveals substantial demographic changes throughout Greece during the 12th and 11th centuries BC, including the abandonment of previously prosperous regions and the appearance of new settlement patterns that differed markedly from earlier Mycenaean urban planning. Ceramic evidence suggests population movements that brought new cultural influences into traditionally Mycenaean areas, while the disappearance of characteristic Mycenaean material culture indicates either population replacement or fundamental changes in social organisation and cultural practices. The evidence for migration includes changes in burial customs that show the adoption of new funeral practices, including cremation, that had not been traditional in Mycenaean culture. Cemetery sites from the post-collapse period reveal different pottery styles, weapon types, and ornamental objects that suggest the arrival of populations with distinct cultural traditions. However, distinguishing between actual population movements and cultural changes adopted by existing populations remains challenging, as archaeological evidence for migration is often ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations. Cultural transformation during the collapse period extended beyond simple population replacement to encompass fundamental changes in social organisation, economic systems, and technological capabilities. The disappearance of palace-centred redistribution systems eliminated the economic foundations that had supported craft specialisation, monumental construction, and long-distance trade. Without palace patronage, skilled craftsmen could no longer maintain the sophisticated production techniques that had characterized Mycenaean material culture, leading to simplified pottery styles, reduced metal working capabilities, and the abandonment of complex architectural projects. The archaeological record from post-collapse settlements reveals dramatically reduced settlement sizes, simplified construction techniques, and material culture assemblages that lack the diversity and sophistication of earlier Mycenaean contexts. The largest settlements of the 11th century BC contained only a few hundred inhabitants, compared to the thousands who had lived in major Mycenaean centres during their peak periods. Housing construction reverted to simple single-room structures that contrasted sharply with the complex multi-room buildings that had characterised Mycenaean residential architecture. The loss of technological knowledge during the collapse had long-lasting effects on Greek material culture and economic capabilities. Bronze-working techniques that had produced sophisticated weapons, tools, and decorative objects were simplified or abandoned entirely, while the knowledge required for constructing Cyclopean fortifications and corbelled tomb chambers disappeared from the archaeological record. The standardized pottery production that had characterized Mycenaean workshops was replaced by handmade ceramics that showed greater regional variation but lower technical quality. The disruption of religious institutions and practices accompanied the broader cultural transformation, though some elements of Mycenaean religious traditions appear to have survived in modified forms. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites shows the abandonment of elaborate palace-sponsored ceremonies and the adoption of simpler ritual practices that required fewer resources and less complex organisation. However, the continuity of certain deity names and religious concepts from Linear B texts into later Greek religion suggests that core elements of Mycenaean theology were preserved through oral traditions that bridge the collapse period. The regional variation in collapse experiences reveals that different areas of the Mycenaean world experienced varying degrees of destruction and cultural continuity. Some regions, particularly in the northern Peloponnese and central Greece, show evidence of more gradual decline and cultural transformation rather than sudden catastrophic destruction. These areas maintained some elements of Mycenaean material culture and settlement patterns into the 11th century BC, suggesting that collapse was not uniformly complete throughout the former Mycenaean territories. The archaeological evidence for continuity includes sites where Mycenaean-style pottery continued to be produced, though in simplified forms and smaller quantities than during the glacial period. Some settlements maintained defensive walls and organised layouts that reflected Mycenaean urban planning traditions, while burial practices in certain regions preserved elements of earlier customs alongside new influences. This selective continuity indicates that collapse involved complex processes of cultural transformation rather than simple replacement of one population by another. The selective continuity evident in certain regions during the collapse period provided crucial bridges between the sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that had dominated the Aegean world and the emerging Iron Age communities that would eventually coalesce into classical Greek culture. The archaeological evidence for this transitional period reveals complex patterns of cultural preservation, adaptation, and innovation that challenge earlier scholarly assumptions about a complete break between Mycenaean and later Greek civilizations. Rather than representing a simple dark age of cultural stagnation, the centuries following the palace collapse witnessed dynamic processes of social reorganization, technological adaptation, and cultural synthesis that laid the foundations for the remarkable achievements of archaic and classical Greece. The persistence of Mycenaean religious traditions provides some of the clearest evidence for cultural continuity across the collapse divide. The Linear B tablets had documented offerings to deities whose names would later appear in classical Greek religion, including Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, suggesting that core elements of the Greek pantheon had already crystallized during the Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals that religious activities continued at many locations despite the abandonment of palace-sponsored ceremonies. The sanctuary at Olympia, which would later become famous for its athletic festivals, shows evidence of continuous ritual activity from the late Bronze Age through the Archaic period, with votive offerings and ceremonial deposits that demonstrate unbroken religious traditions spanning several centuries. The transformation of religious practices during the post-collapse period involved significant simplification of ceremonial activities while maintaining essential theological concepts and ritual structures. The elaborate palace festivals documented in Linear B archives, which had required hundreds of animals and vast quantities of agricultural products, were replaced by smaller-scale community ceremonies that reflected the reduced economic capabilities of Iron Age settlements. However, the basic ritual patterns remained consistent, including animal sacrifice, libation offerings, and communal feasting that preserved the fundamental relationship between human communities and their divine protectors. The continuity of place names throughout Greece provides another crucial link between Mycenaean and later Greek culture. Many locations mentioned in Linear B tablets retained their names through the collapse period and into historical times, suggesting that local populations maintained their territorial identities despite broader political and social upheavals. The name Pylos itself appears in both Bronze Age archives and later Greek literature, while numerous other toponyms recorded in Linear B texts can be identified with classical Greek cities and regions. This onomastic continuity indicates that significant portions of the population remained in their traditional territories throughout the transitional period, adapting to the new circumstances while preserving essential cultural and geographical knowledge. Settlement patterns during the early Iron Age reveal complex relationships between abandoned Mycenaean centres and emerging new communities. many of the most important classical Greek cities were established near but not directly on top of major Bronze Age sites. Athens represents a notable exception to this pattern, showing continuous occupation from the late Bronze Age through the Classical period, though the settlement contracted significantly during the collapse centuries before expanding again during the Archaic period. The Athenian Acropolis contained a Mycenaean palace complex that was gradually transformed into a religious sanctuary, preserving the sacred character of the site while adapting its function to new social and political requirements. The gradual recovery of settlement size and complexity during the 10th and 9th centuries BC demonstrates the resilience of Greek communities and their capacity for cultural regeneration. Archaeological surveys reveal the establishment of new villages and towns throughout previously depopulated regions, with settlement patterns that reflected both practical considerations and cultural preferences inherited from the Bronze Age past. These emerging communities adopted defensive positions on hilltops and coastal promontories that recalled Mycenaean strategic thinking, while developing new forms of social organisation appropriate to their smaller scale and reduced resources. The technological innovations that characterised the early Iron Age represented both responses to immediate practical needs and foundations for future cultural development. The introduction of iron metallurgy during the 11th century BC provided Greek communities with access to superior tools and weapons, while reducing their dependence on imported copper and tin that had been essential for bronze production. Iron ore was more widely available throughout Greek territories than the materials required for bronze, enabling local communities to develop greater technological self-sufficiency. The transition to ironworking required new technical knowledge and specialised skills, but these were more easily acquired and maintained at the community level than the complex bronze working techniques that had characterised Mycenaean palace workshops. Pottery production during the early Iron Age reveals fascinating combinations of innovation and tradition that illuminate broader cultural processes during the transitional period. The sophisticated wheel-made ceramics that had characterised Mycenaean workshops were largely replaced by handmade vessels that showed greater regional variation but maintained certain traditional Greek preferences for specific shapes and decorative motifs. The development of proto-geometric pottery during the 10th century BC represented a crucial step toward the artistic renaissance that would characterise later Greek culture, combining geometric decorative schemes with technical innovations that improved both the functionality and aesthetic appeal of ceramic vessels. The geometric patterns that dominated early Iron Age pottery design may have preserved decorative traditions that originated in Mycenaean textile production, which had employed complex geometric motifs in woven fabrics. The Linear B tablets document sophisticated textile workshops that produced elaborately decorated garments using techniques that required mathematical precision and artistic skill. The disappearance of palace textile production eliminated these complex weaving traditions, but their decorative elements may have been preserved in pottery design, metalwork, and other craft activities that continued at the community level. Burial customs during the transitional period reveal complex negotiations between inherited traditions and practical adaptations to new circumstances. The elaborate chamber tombs and tholos structures that had characterized Mycenaean elite burials were too expensive and technically demanding for Iron Age communities to maintain, leading to the adoption of simpler burial practices that nonetheless preserved certain essential elements of earlier funeral traditions. Cremation became increasingly common during this period, representing both a practical response to reduced resources and a cultural innovation that would become standard in later Greek practice. The grave goods found in Iron Age burials demonstrate continuities in social values and cultural preferences, despite significant changes in material capabilities. Warriors continued to be buried with their weapons, though iron swords and spears replaced the bronze equivalents that had characterized Mycenaean military equipment. Women's burials contained jewellery and household items that maintained traditional associations between gender roles and material culture, while the presence of imported goods in some contexts indicates that long-distance trade relationships were gradually re-establishing despite the collapse of Bronze Age commercial networks. The oral poetry traditions that preserved Mycenaean cultural memory represent perhaps the most significant mechanism for transmitting Bronze Age heritage to later Greek civilization. The Homeric epics, though composed centuries after the events they purport to describe, contain remarkable amounts of accurate information about Mycenaean material culture, social organisation, and geographical knowledge that could only have been preserved through continuous oral transmission. The detailed descriptions of bronze weapons, boar's tusk helmets, figure-eight shields, and other Mycenaean military equipment in the Iliad and Odyssey demonstrate the extraordinary capacity of oral tradition to maintain technical and cultural knowledge across centuries of social transformation. Archaeological discoveries have repeatedly confirmed the historical accuracy of Homeric descriptions of Bronze Age material culture, validating the reliability of oral tradition as a mechanism for cultural preservation. The famous boar's tusk helmet, described in the Iliad, matches precisely the reconstructed helmets found in Mycenaean graves, while the tower shields and bronze weapons mentioned in the epics correspond closely to archaeological finds from Bronze Age contexts. These correspondences cannot be explained by coincidence or later antiquarian research, indicating that authentic Bronze Age memories were embedded in the epic traditions that eventually found written expression in the Archaic period. The social values and behavioural patterns described in Homeric poetry also reflect authentic Bronze Age traditions that were preserved through oral transmission. The emphasis on personal honour, competitive display, and reciprocal gift exchange that characterises Homeric society corresponds closely to the social organisation documented in Linear B archives and revealed through archaeological analysis of Mycenaean burial practices. The complex relationships between kings, nobles and commoners described in the epics reflect political hierarchies that were characteristic of Bronze Age palace societies, though these were adapted and reinterpreted to reflect the social conditions of later periods. The geographical knowledge preserved in Homeric poetry provides additional evidence for the continuity of cultural memory across the collapse period. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad contains detailed information about Bronze Age political geography, including the territories controlled by different Mycenaean kingdoms and the relationships between major centres. This geographical framework corresponds remarkably well with archaeological evidence for a Mycenaean political organisation, suggesting that territorial boundaries and political relationships were preserved in oral tradition even after the collapse of the palace systems that created them. The heroic genealogies that connected classical Greek aristocratic families with legendary Bronze Age figures served crucial functions in legitimising political authority and maintaining cultural continuity. These genealogical traditions, preserved in epic poetry and local historical accounts, provided frameworks for understanding the relationship between contemporary communities and their illustrious predecessors. The families that claimed descent from Homeric heroes used these connections to justify their political prominence and social status, creating institutional mechanisms for preserving Bronze Age cultural memory while adapting it to serve Iron Age political needs. The role of aristocratic families in preserving and transmitting cultural traditions extended beyond simple genealogical claims to encompass broader responsibilities for maintaining religious practices, cultural knowledge, and artistic traditions. These elite groups served as patrons for the bards and craftsmen who preserved and developed the cultural heritage inherited from the Bronze Age, providing economic support and social status that enabled specialized cultural activities to continue, despite the simplified economic conditions of the early Iron Age. The gradual re-establishment of long-distance trade relationships during the 9th and 8th centuries BC created new opportunities for cultural exchange and technological innovation that would contribute to the Greek Renaissance of the Archaic period. Archaeological evidence reveals the resumption of contact with Eastern Mediterranean civilizations, including renewed imports of luxury goods, raw materials, and artistic influences that had been absent during the collapsed centuries. These renewed contacts brought Greek communities into contact with alphabetic writing systems that would be adapted to create the Greek alphabet, enabling the recording of oral traditions and the development of new forms of literary expression. The adoption of alphabetic writing during the 8th century BC represented a crucial turning point that enabled the preservation and development of cultural traditions that had previously depended entirely on oral transmission. The Greek alphabet, derived from Phoenician prototypes but adapted to represent Greek phonetic patterns, provided a flexible and efficient means for recording both practical information and literary compositions. The earliest Greek inscriptions include both administrative records and poetic compositions, indicating that writing was immediately recognized as valuable for both practical and cultural purposes. The influence of Mycenaean architectural traditions on later Greek building practices demonstrates another important mechanism for cultural continuity. The megaron structures that had served as throne rooms in Bronze Age palaces provided prototypes for the temple architecture that would become characteristic of classical Greek religious buildings. The basic plan of a rectangular hall with a front porch, supported by columns and containing a central hearth or altar, was adapted from Mycenaean palatial architecture to serve the religious needs of Iron Age communities. This architectural continuity created physical links between Bronze Age and later Greek culture while providing appropriate settings for religious practices that preserved essential elements of earlier traditions. The development of Greek temple architecture during the Archaic period involved systematic refinement of proportional relationships, decorative systems, and construction techniques that had originated in Mycenaean building practices. The use of stone columns to support wooden roof structures, the emphasis on symmetrical facades, and the integration of sculptural decoration into architectural frameworks all reflected principles that had been established during the Bronze Age. However, these inherited elements were combined with new influences from Eastern Mediterranean civilizations and innovative solutions to technical and aesthetic challenges that created distinctly Greek architectural traditions. The preservation of Mycenaean place names and territorial boundaries provided frameworks for the political reorganization that characterized the Archaic period. Many of the city-states that emerged during the 8th and 7th centuries BC were established in regions that had been important during the Bronze Age, suggesting that political geography was influenced by cultural memories of earlier territorial organization. The boundaries between different Greek communities often reflected ancient divisions that may have originated in Mycenaean administrative arrangements, though these were adapted to serve the needs of smaller-scale political units that were characteristic of Iron Age social organization. The cultural synthesis that produced classical Greek civilization involved complex processes of selection, adaptation, and innovation that transformed Bronze Age heritage while preserving its essential character. The democratic institutions that would become characteristic of many Greek city-states represented innovations that had no direct Bronze Age precedents, though they incorporated concepts of community participation and collective decision-making that may have derived from the assembly institutions documented in Linear B tablets. The emphasis on individual achievement and competitive excellence that characterized Greek culture reflected values that had been central to Mycenaean warrior society, though these were expressed through new institutions, including athletic competitions and artistic contests. The intellectual traditions that would produce Greek philosophy, science, and historical writing during the classical period built upon foundations of rational inquiry and systematic observation that may have originated in the administrative practices of Bronze Age palace societies. The Linear B archives demonstrate sophisticated approaches to record keeping mathematical calculation, and systematic analysis that provided precedents for the intellectual methods that would characterize later Greek scholarship. The transition from oral to written culture during the Archaic period enabled these intellectual traditions to develop greater complexity and precision while maintaining their essential Greek character. The transformation of Mycenaean civilization into the cultural foundations of classical Greece represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural continuity through periods of apparent collapse and discontinuity. The mechanisms that preserved essential elements of Bronze Age heritage while enabling adaptation to new circumstances demonstrate the resilience of cultural traditions and their capacity for regeneration under favourable conditions. The legacy of Mycenaean civilization extended far beyond simple material survivals to encompass fundamental values, institutional patterns, and cultural orientations that would continue to influence Greek development for centuries. The rediscovery of Mycenaean civilization through archaeological excavation has revealed the deep historical roots of Greek culture, while demonstrating the complexity of cultural transmission across periods of social transformation. The Linear B tablets, monumental architecture, and sophisticated material culture of Bronze Age Greece provide evidence for achievements that rivaled contemporary civilizations throughout the ancient world, while establishing traditions that would influence European development for millennia. The story of Mycenaean civilization thus represents not merely an episode in Bronze Age history, but a crucial chapter in the broader narrative of European cultural development, demonstrating how ancient achievements could survive periods of apparent collapse to inspire new forms of cultural expression and political organization.